Luonan had long since grasped the basic principles of matching the structure of body and soul. He had used his mother's coupling theory in conjunction with Gym Master Xiu's 9 orifices 6 roots technique to gradually fumble his way out. Luonan possessed an extremely strong personal style. Now that he had combined it with the concept of extraterrestrial civilization described by the lamination interference technology and verified it with each other, regardless of whether it was compatible or not, it was still an experience. He set his sights higher and gradually formed an ideal outline. He used this standard to examine himself and the physical and spiritual framework of the people around him. There was no doubt that most of them, including him, were defective goods. This won't work. As expected, I still have to invest elsewhere. What? Old Hand thought that Mr. Mo was talking to him, so he turned around. Luonan shook his head. He just said, "There's no need to change the basic design. Can you handle the fine-tuning of the details now?" Of course, the rent for this workshop is high, but the equipment is complete. There was no need to return to the factory. It would only take half an hour at most. However, I need your cooperation. Oh. Old Hand emptied his mind when it came to the field of expertise. His voice was raised by half a pitch. This toy is rough, but it's still an exoskeleton. It's also custom-made. It needs to be adjusted according to the actual situation. Mr. Mo is using it for himself, right? It's best to get on it and take a look. Makes sense. Luonan readily accepted the advice, even though there was a bit of difference between the actual situation and what Old Hand imagined. At this time, Old Hand was a bit hesitant. Is it convenient? Luonan laughed when he saw Old Hand's gaze cast at his legs. That was right. He was still a disabled person. Actually, a few days of time was enough for the replaced spinal nerves to fully integrate with his body. He didn't even sit in a wheelchair indoors anymore. When he went out, he reluctantly sat in a wheelchair for the sake of maintaining his persona. Old Hand only knew that Mr. Mo was recovering from his injuries. He was worried that it would cause a relapse. There's nothing inconvenient about it. Luonan took 2 steady steps and assumed a stance. He indicated to Old Hand to help him put the exoskeleton, which still had a bit of warmth, on his body. It was a simple and crude exoskeleton frame. The power and conduction devices weren't installed. It was more like a burden to forcefully put it on his body. But Old Hand was an expert in this field. Luonan had a good grasp of the situation. He gave it a simple test on his body and roughly understood the situation. The load-bearing spine is conservative. The flexibility can be adjusted a bit. It's fine if it's not carrying weight. If you want flexibility, the lower limbs can be adjusted. The joint design can be changed. Chapter 833. This must be the big shots from the inner world. I can't compete with them. I can't compete with them. Sure enough, it's more realistic for a small fry to build a shelter bit by bit. Compared to the capriciousness of the Great Swamp Church, Veteran had a stronger resistance to the bizarre scene in front of him. After a slight fluctuation in his heart, he regained his balance. He looked at the exquisite structure that Mr. Mo had planned purely with an attitude of appreciation and knowledge. He saw that the dark red color of the exoskeleton's skeleton due to repeated processing had become more intense. It seemed to be glowing as if the marrow inside the skeleton had turned into a fluid that passed through the various connection points of the exoskeleton and connected them step by step. It was obvious that the aberration trait inside had been activated. Veteran was most familiar with his own work. He could see the state of the processed skeleton at a glance. While processing, the activity of the aberration trait was retained. This was the core of this set of technology, and it was also the most valuable part. Generally speaking, this reserved aberration trait existed as a stimulant. It stimulated the user's potential for a short period of time and exploded with extraordinary power. Then the user would have to bear the corresponding risks. That minor brother of the Soul Church had half died because of this. However, the aberration trait usually took effect through infiltration and infection of flesh and blood. There was not much meaning in simply activating it. Mr. Mo, on the other hand, seemed to be using it as some kind of fuel. As for the first fire that ignited it, Mr. Mo's deeply controlled and rhythmic breathing, as well as the somewhat inflated outline of his body, formed an obvious causal relationship with it. Veteran judged that Mr. Mo had activated his physical strength, giving the skeleton a driving force, causing the aberration trait inside to ignite. It circulated and changed in the specially designed structure before being output to the outer layer. The inner layer, the middle layer, followed by the outer layer. The illusory light and shadow symbols that were presented by the projection function seemed to have become a substantial existence. The energy that was transmitted from the inner and middle layers was injected into it. It flowed endlessly along the planned structure and gradually dispersed in an orderly manner, causing the three-dimensional projection structure of the outermost layer to become more and more complex. Veteran's vision was a little blurred. He unconsciously blinked, and when his pupils focused again, the scene in front of him became even more absurd. The complex projection symbols and structure at the outermost layer gradually became blurred. To be more precise, what was blurred was the boundary between them and the surrounding space. Chapter 835. Luonan thought that if he understood the actions of Her Majesty Empress Wu and the Xia City branch as him standing on the field to support them, wouldn't he be a bit too presumptuous? He wanted to say something, but he felt that it was hard to express himself. In the end he just responded, "I really can't decide on my side for now." Yuan wasn't surprised at all. "It doesn't matter. Just let me know before 9 o'clock in the morning." Luonan let out a breath. "Thank you, Sister Yuan. Also thank Her Majesty Empress Wu, President Ouyang, and the others on my behalf." Luonan asked Yuan about the recent situation in Xia City, then he ended the call. Then he sighed. The most willful time seemed to have passed. He needed to collect his thoughts. He couldn't be as unpredictable as Bai Xinyan. Speaking of which, that woman was clearly very smart. Why did she jump around so happily when it came to offending him? Oh, wait a moment. If this woman left. It didn't seem to be that simple. Luonan suddenly thought of something. He walked to the door and opened it. Sure enough, he saw Old Hand on the phone in the corridor outside. He was arranging the gathering of raw materials for the exoskeleton. Old Hand quickly hung up the phone when he saw Luonan open the door. He walked over and asked, "Mr. Mo, do you have any other orders?" Luonan thought for a moment and said, "Master Shou, you guys will have to work a bit harder during this period of time. Do the preparatory work well. Once the final technological process is confirmed, we need to see the finished product as soon as possible." Of course. Also, Luonan felt that it wasn't too appropriate halfway through his words. He forcefully swallowed the latter half of his words back down. Old Hand misunderstood his meaning. He patted his chest and said, "Our group of people is absolutely trustworthy when it comes to scheduling orders and working deadlines. We won't be disturbed by other things. I've always told the children that back in the wilderness, they needed to finish the work in their hands first even if they were to be stabbed outside. I've beaten them out of it long ago. Besides, Secretary Yin has helped us quite a bit these past 2 days. As long as Mr. Mo's conditions don't change, we'll just be wasting time with the Great Zay Order. We have several hundred people on our side. All of us are of one mind. You can be at ease." Old Hand spoke heroically, but he was actually probing Luonan a step further. Of course Luonan wanted to calm his mind. He didn't want to give him any other pressure. So he laughed and said, "I naturally trust you, Master. We also urgently want to make this deal happen. How about this? I'll ask Secretary Yin to arrange a time to invite the President out for a serious discussion in the next 2 days. This is good." Although Mr. Mo didn't give a definite promise, his positive attitude was enough to satisfy the veteran. Of course, it was mostly because of Mr. Mo's magnanimous attitude during the cooperation process. That set of extremely valuable exoskeleton design plan and processing technology was taken out without any concealment. For a veteran, who was still a technician in his bones, this could show his character more than anything else. When the veteran left, his mood was completely different from when he first arrived. Luonan was quite happy to see Luonan's mood lift. But the more it was like this, the more he needed to follow up and deal with this matter. He returned to the house and sat behind the workbench. He rested his chin on his hand and pondered for a long time. Finally, he made up his mind and extended his consciousness. Where is the process at? Inside the warehouse at the passenger terminal. Captain Jimmy rushed back after receiving the news. He was still wearing a bright shirt and beach pants. He wore wooden clogs on his feet. He was completely out of tune with the atmosphere of the temporary command center, but his mentality was more positive and urgent than anyone else here. The intelligence clerk responded, "According to Captain's intentions, the operation has already been submitted. Due to the lack of a supervisor in Ban City, it has already been sent to the East Asia Affairs Department. Get to the point." The intelligence clerk jumped in fright. His speed of speech instantly doubled. The affairs department has already approved it. 3 out of the 5 people in the process have already signed. Only the opinions of the director and the former supervisor are left. The deputy next to him frowned when he heard this. Captain, if this is the case, then wouldn't it fall into the hands of Manager Bai? Captain Jimmy was quite certain. Since she has left Ban City, she has separated herself from the concrete affairs. How could she have the face to compete with me, a first-line supervisor? I endured for 3 days before I sent this application. I'm already giving her enough face. Her attitude, to put it bluntly, shows that she is unwilling to take risks. Now that she has already left, what is there to fear? Besides, the others have already signed, but she is still making excuses. I have to suspect that among the group of people we want to arrest, there might be some gigolos that she is keeping behind others' backs. Captain Jimmy tore off his open-chest floral shirt. Everyone get to your positions. Let's try to settle this matter by tonight. We have been delayed in Ban City for too long. The deep roar of the engine sounded as the giant armored airship shuttled through the vast clouds. With its huge size alone, it could deter a limited number of mutant birds living in the stratosphere and provide them with basic peace. At present, intercontinental civil aviation flights were increasingly using this type of vehicle, which was far larger and safer than large passenger planes, to defend against the threat of flying mutants. He had just said that this woman was simply a cold-blooded execution machine. What was she doing now? Without waiting for Yukawa Isuk to ask, Bai Xinyan said softly, Isuk, I heard you have a lot of women outside. Are we that close? The corner of Yukawa's mouth twitched. He really wanted to do what Bai Xinyan had done just now and fight back. But the reason he provoked Bai Xinyan in the first place was because he wanted to chat with her to relieve his boredom. Then he thought about the 20-hour-long flight ahead and decided to be magnanimous. Yes, I'm ashamed that I don't have a good grasp of such relationships. As he spoke, Yukawa Isuk glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to figure out what this woman was up to. Do you usually use them to entertain guests? Hey. You're not going to be unreasonable about this, are you? Ahem, if you want to use this standard to judge me and consider the future of our relationship, I will be very disappointed. The topic was a little wild, but Yukawa Isuk was not a fledgling. To put it bluntly, they were just teasing each other. As a man, he could accept such an atmosphere. However, Bai Xinyan's expression looked like she was discussing a very serious topic. Even though Yukawa Isuk did not confirm it, she continued to speak according to the established inference. Now there is such a poor person. She followed your instructions to entertain guests and asked for something from them. But the guests found out and it caused some trouble. Faced with the anger of the guests, what would you do, Mr. Yukawa? Oh, you don't have to answer that. Let's move on to the next question. If Mr. Yukawa was even more unlucky and reincarnated as this woman, faced with such a situation, what would you think? What would you do? Yukawa Isuk let out a ha, but did not say anything else. Bai Xinyan smiled and did not look at the other's expression. She extended her finger, verified her authority in the virtual workspace, and prepared to sign the application. Yasorno this time? The answer is already there. Bai Xinyan was halfway through her sentence, but the rest of her words were strangely stuck in her throat. Her finger, which was already in the projection area, froze. She tilted her head slightly, trying to look across the aisle to the opposite side. However, before she could react, the voice from the other side sounded again. Before making a decision, it's never wrong to consider the consequences. Bai Xinyan's finger, which was in the projection area, subconsciously curled back halfway. You could have lived a good life, but you insisted on creating an irreconcilable situation. The way you people think is really strange. It was still Yukawa Isuk's voice, but his words were full of admonishment and regret. There was a subtle difference from before. And that tone and speed of speech, especially the resentful and distressed tone at the end. Bai Xinyan finally aimed her gaze at the target, and what she saw was still Yukawa Isuk's face. But on this face, the lower half of the mouth opened and closed, the lingering sound lingering. The upper half, especially around the eyes, the upper half, especially around the eye sockets, was tight and twisted, almost bursting from the bulging eyeballs. Inside, there was an unstoppable sense of confusion and fear. Bai Xinyan was a little dazed. She looked at Yukawa Isuk on the other side of the aisle. She looked at this powerful figure who could make half of Osaka shake with a stomp of his foot. He raised his right hand in an extremely stiff posture. It was as if there were invisible ropes tied around his arm. Every movement was like a bondage and pain. It took Yukawa Aishuk a full 5 seconds to place his palm on the front of his face and press it down. Bai Xinyan could already confirm that he wanted to cover his mouth, to seal his lips, teeth and tongue, which were completely out of his control. There was no doubt that this was an extremely stupid move that would not work. But when a person suddenly lost control of a part of their body, they could only watch helplessly as they became someone else's mouthpiece. No one could say that their reaction at this moment was more sensible than Yukawa Aishuk's. With a loud slap, the palm finally landed on Yukawa Aishuk's forehead. It sealed his eyes, almost flattened his nose, but it still could not stop the mouth that was out of control. Yukawa Aishuk still spoke in a fluent voice. The method might be a little rough. I originally wanted to have a more private conversation and discuss it, but everyone's defenses are different. Bai Xinyan's mind suddenly flashed. She suddenly stood up and shouted at Yukawa Aishuk, who was still sealed by the palm and twisted face. Calm down, he can't completely control you. Chapter 837. Most of the people here were reputable people in Osaka's circle. Of course, there were some who knew Yukawa Aishuk and wanted to ask about it. Currently, other than the two people involved, the others only thought that there was an argument. On the other side, the air stewardess tried to rush to the scene, but soon, a few burly bodyguards had already overtaken her and surrounded Bai Xinyan and Yukawa Aishuk. Mr. Aishuk, you, the head of the Yukawa family's bodyguards, Kitano Sukito, rushed to the front and wanted to ask what was going on, but when he saw, Lord of Stars, Chapter 516, Upgraded, Part 1, please wait a moment. After the content has been updated, please refresh the page to get the latest update. Chapter 838. Kitano Sukito's reaction was very fast. The chain of clues was also very complete. However, there wasn't much of a difference between ability users and ordinary people when it came to the level of imagination. If he could think of it, then the few important people in the first-class cabin who knew the relevant information would also be able to think of it. Infrasonic wave array. The person who called out with a trembling voice was quite obvious. The person who called out wasn't brave enough. His voice was trembling and his legs were trembling. He lost his balance and nearly fell to the ground. Fortunately, someone supported him from behind, but it still caused a commotion. Kitano Sukito swept his gaze over and recognized the identity of the person who spoke. He was a senior official of a certain department of the Sakura government. He was a well-known figure among the important people in the first-class cabin. At the very least, his words were easy to believe. Maekawa, this idiot! Kitano Sukito cried out in his mind. The people present might not know about the Cage Master, but the infrasonic wave array was a standard part of the city's defense. The degree of perception and understanding of it instantly increased. People couldn't help but think. Why did the Maekawa official say infrasonic wave array? Why did he have this kind of reaction? Everyone was on an airship tens of thousands of meters high in the sky. This was the information age. Even vague fragments of information could be found online. If the information couldn't be found online, they could still ask. Which of these people in the first-class cabin didn't have relatives or friends in key positions? The first-class cabin was instantly enveloped in a chaotic and extremely negative atmosphere. Phone calls were made one by one. Even if not everyone could obtain the complete information, they could still communicate with each other. A rough outline would be pieced together sooner or later. Kitano Sukito's head split into two. From his understanding of the mental side, since Luonan used negative emotions to invade Yukawa Aishuk, then it was very likely that Luonan used the emotions of other people to carry out his plan. Wouldn't this situation be like a fish in water? Kitano Sukito took a deep breath. He used his own face to assume an even fiercer posture. Mr. Maekawa and everyone else, please calm down. Return to your seats right now. We have the situation under control. At the very least, there were no visible intruders at the level of this group of people. No matter what you guys did to Mr. Yukawa, it has nothing to do with us. Kitano Sutoto almost punched this random person out of the airship. Fortunately, there were still some smart people here. The guy who had just said something stupid was immediately stopped, and the vice minister of Maekawa, who had exposed the dangerous situation earlier, was pushed to the front with a bitter face. We need to be treated humanely. The situation we're facing right now is not something we want to see. We did not interfere in the grudge between Mr. Yuchuan and Cage Master Teacher, and we do not wish to do so now. We're innocent, thousands of innocent passengers. This senior bureaucrat was quite good at handling his emotions very well. His trembling voice and body were rather contagious. So much so that two ladies started to cry. Well said. This guy who took the citizen's tax and sat in first class wasn't completely useless after all. This was one of the most appropriate negotiation methods that Kitano Satoto could think of. Although the cage master often took out the infrasonic wave array and swung it around, he only pulled the trigger once and the range was controlled. As long as they could stop this killer weapon, they would have a chance to catch their breath and even counterattack. Thinking of this, Kitano Satoto's gaze turned to Xia Hui, who was sitting on the back of the mountain. Xia Hui was holding the Magatama tightly in his hand, and a faint light seeped through the gaps between his fingers. Was it useful? Kitano Satoto really wanted to ask this question, but Xia Hui didn't respond. Yukawa Isuk, who was firmly restrained in his seat, turned his gaze over and sighed, "I'm clearly the victim." Kitano Satoto's face was dark and he didn't make a sound. Luckily, the vice minister of Maikawa had already gotten into character. He took the initiative to say, "Mr. Luonan, no Mr. Luonan, please consider the innocent passengers on the airship. Thousands of people, thousands of families. If anything happens, it will be an irreversible tragedy." Yes, it really is a tragedy. Yukawa Isuk's face revealed a huge, strange smile. Actually, if it weren't for you guys messing around here, I would have already said goodbye and left. Mr. Scallop, are you done messing around? Swoosh swoosh swoosh. Everyone's gazes focused on the face of Xia Hui, who had been silent for a long time. But before they could ask anything, a bright light lit up in front of their eyes. It was so piercing that everyone subconsciously averted their gazes and shielded their eyes. Yukawa Isuk, who was forcefully restrained, also narrowed his eyes. But soon he instinctively opened them, allowing the strong light to penetrate his pupils. Tears flowed from his eyes and his body trembled. Actually, this light was good for him. The light on the material plane was projected onto the mental plane, and it turned into a dazzling sun. The heat emitted by this sun was quite compatible with Yukawa Isuk's mental structure. Everywhere the light went, there was a subtle and clear response. This way, the intruder from the outside world would naturally be exposed. Indeed, the intruder Luonan was partially exposed to the sunlight. In fact, if it was a simple and crude invasion from the outside, this Magatama would have automatically reacted and repelled it. There was no need for Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain, to stimulate it with external power. But that kind of spontaneous reaction would not be as strong as it was now, and it would have a considerable follow-up power. That's it. The corner of Yukawa Isuk's mouth twitched slightly, showing that the Magatama's counterattack was somewhat effective. Luonan's degree of control over Yukawa Isuk was somewhat reduced, and he really did not plan on exerting his strength a second time. Don't even think about running. The unyielding voice came from Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. After the Magatama's power was completely stimulated, Xia Hui's small body seemed to have expanded by a size. His face was bright, and his facial features and 7 orifices were all connected to the Magatama's light. This was the case on the material plane. On the mental plane, the special symbolic sun, under the blessing of Xia Hui, produced even more changes. It activated certain factors within Yukawa Isuk's frame, causing it to sprout and rapidly grow into an invisible thicket of intertwining branches and leaves. The thicket could sense the changes inside and outside, and it locked onto the completely different nature of the intruder. Its roots and leaves continued to grow like long ropes of chains, in an attempt to bind and imprison the intruder. The changes in configuration are really beautiful. The image is also very unified. Yukawa Isuk sighed in admiration. Is this a simplified version of the Fusang Purewood? On the other side, Bai Xinyan suddenly asked, "Are you from the Amaterasu order?" The person she was asking was naturally Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. The latter, who was controlling the Magatama, did not respond immediately. Instead, Kitano Sukido explained, Yamato was born in a family of Onmyoji masters. He later became a disciple of the Pope. In the time it took to say these 2 sentences, Yamato Xia Hui had a better grasp of the situation. He interrupted Kitano Sukido with a clear voice, "I will lock onto the intruder's position and immediately contact the radar or satellite positioning system. He can't be too far away from here." Bai Xinyan frowned while Kitano Sukido's eyes lit up. In fact, he had a belly full of anger right now. If he could find Luonan's position and Luonan had a missile launch button in his hand, he would press it without hesitation. Don't complicate things. Bai Xinyan hesitated for a moment before advising Kitano Sukido. He's already retreating. This is just a warning. Just. Kitano Sukido's eyes were as sharp as knives. Miss Bai Xinyan, the Yukawa family respects your opinion, but we hope that you can respect our profession. If that person can come once, then he can come a second time and a third time. You guys can't do anything to him. In the vast Pacific Ocean at an altitude of 10,000 meters, how were a bunch of ordinary people going to deal with the powerful ability users who were riding the flying devil rays that were several times faster than the speed of sound when they were riding on civilian airships that seemed stable but lacked countermeasures? You guys can't do anything, but that doesn't mean that the order can't. Mountainback Xiaohui responded. He turned his head and used a cold and arrogant gaze to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Unrelated people, please keep your distance. Don't interfere with my casting. At this moment, Mountainback Xiaohui naturally became the person in charge. Even Kitano Sukido had to give in to him a bit. Because at this moment, Mountainback Xiaohui was no longer just an external bodyguard. He represented the stance of the Order of Amaterasu. Bai Xinyan raised her eyebrows. Your Yukawa family is willing to be the bait. Kitano Sukido's expression was very ugly. As the head bodyguard, he felt that his authority had been violated. But it was useless to say anything now. Mountainback Xiaohui's mouth was already flowing with a mysterious and incomprehensible incantation. The incantation buzzed in the half-sealed space. Yukawa Aishuk was still squirming with his crooked and twitching mouth. He complained, "Why do you keep looking up? The Order of Justice doesn't do this. Is this the difference between the Order of Ideals and the Order of Gods?" Some of the people present understood these words, some did not, and some pretended not to understand. In short, no one responded. Kitano Sukido and the group of bodyguards stared at Yukawa Aishuk's body. Xiaohui continued to chant his incantation, while Bai Xinyan continued to retreat quietly. At this moment, Yukawa Aishuk's eyes followed her and locked onto her position. He transmitted the attention and pressure hidden behind the layers of clouds and the void. Maybe everyone should be open and honest for once. Soldiers are soldiers, generals are generals. Even if we can't negotiate, we can still fight. My words may be a little childish, but it's really boring for you to keep knocking on my door like this. Bai Xinyan had a bitter smile on her face, but she had already made up her mind not to speak. She had a strong premonition that the less she spoke now, the less trouble she would have in the future. If she could survive this escalating situation. Seeing that Bai Xinyan was refusing to cooperate, the other side looked a little depressed. Forget it. Maybe I shouldn't have come today. I'll find a more suitable method next time. I've got you. You use a lot of exclamations. What? This sudden sentence caused Xiaohui's thoughts and emotions to stagnate. He was, after all, a Class B mind master and he was very sensitive to the relevant fields. With this reminder, he did not let himself be led around by the nose. Instead, he suddenly realized a crucial point. Wasn't the feedback from the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure a little too slow? It was also at this moment that Yukawa Aishuk, with his crooked mouth and slanted eyes, revealed a horrifying smile. That Pope of Baji didn't teach you seriously. Such a complicated configuration. You know how it works but you don't know why. How can you succeed? Under the effect of the Magatama's power, Yukawa Aishuk gradually lost control over the structure of Yukawa Aishuk's body and soul. But the muffled voice in his throat was like a highly viscous acid. It sprayed out and adhered to Xiaohui's face and soul, burning and penetrating. There were two waves of pain. The first wave was the pain of being pierced in the deepest and most private corner of one's heart. The other wave was the unique sense of danger that came from the mind. Oh no, I've been hit. Without giving Xiaohui a chance to analyze it in depth, in the spiritual plane that he saw and sensed, the exquisite composition that had been unfurled actually began to slowly roll back. It was retracted. Xiaohui's eyeballs nearly bulged out of their sockets like Yukawa Aishuk's. His consciousness played no role at all. In fact, it was just as Luonan said. The Pope of Baji gave Xiaohui the method to stimulate and maintain the Magatama's power, but she did not give him the method to use it flexibly. The Pope of Baji did not go so far as to be selfish. It was mainly because Xiaohui had not reached that level. He did not possess the knowledge reserves. Every structure, every section, and every detail of such a complex structure would affect the entire structure. Xiaohui, who was on the back of the mountain, was able to maintain the stability of the whole structure and successfully act as a fulcrum to sense and feedback information. He was already worthy of the role the church had given him. But this kind of role was not enough in the face of the orderly retraction of the configuration before his eyes. Spilled water was hard to retrieve, but everything that appeared on the mental plane was simply like reversing time. The power of the Fusang divine tree that had already unfurled was retracted bit by bit. Came back the way it came. There was not a trace of error, not a bit of wastage. But even on the mental plane, the circulation of energy had to obey basic laws. How could entropy increase and entropy decrease consume the same amount of energy? The most terrifying expenditure of the effect of reversing time was the astronomical calculation of the law. It consumed Luonan's brain power and control. He did it if he wanted to. But the remaining portion was completely squeezed back into the power of the Magatama, and this power was suppressed back to its original state. Xia Hui and the Magatama were affected by the entire activation mechanism. To a certain degree they were one entity. There was no need to consider the boundaries of the reverse retraction. The retraction of the Magatama's power took advantage of the situation and pushed Xia Hui back in time. Of course, this was an exaggeration. His mental state and mind were completely unprepared for the retraction of the Magatama's power. His entire body was crushed to the point of suffocation. His swollen body instantly deflated. Xia Hui's body looked like it had its bones pulled out. He fell limply to the ground, unconscious. Phew. That was close. Yukawa Aisuk sighed as he looked at Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. I almost got myself into big trouble. Fortunately, Luonan had fought with the propping mulberry tree system of the Amaterasu cult many times over the past few days. He had seen the brain demon, the horn demon, the fat dragon, and many other similar tricks. Only then was he able to come up with this method of reverse sealing. Of course, this was also because he saw the opportunity quickly and made use of his understanding of the configuration of the great divine treasure of the Fusang divine tree. He also made use of the opportunity when Xia Hui was controlling the Magatama on the back of the mountain and had no time to pay attention to anything else. He took the first step to induce his negative emotions, giving him illusions and misleading him, distorting the feedback of the entire sensory channel. Just this skill alone was enough to prove that he hadn't been communicating with Mr. Bai for half a year. But the more it was like this, the harder it was for Luonan to deal a heavy blow to Bai Xinyan. He didn't have much hope that the previous threats would achieve anything. Also, sealing off the mountain back of Xia Hui might not solve the problem once and for all. Perhaps choosing to come here today was a mistake in itself. Luonan brought Yukawa Aisuk to sigh, breaking the deathly silence in the first-class cabin. He was still the center of attention. Everyone's gazes were filled with fear, bewilderment, and ignorance. At least at this very moment, every single one of them had basically lost the will and confidence to control their own lives. In reality, their fates of life and death depended on Luonan's will. It depended on a single thought. This included Kitano Sakuto, who had clenched his fists but couldn't find a target to exert his strength on. This head bodyguard stared blankly at Xia Hui on the back of the mountain. He looked at his temporary partner. Xia Hui held the Magatama that was no longer glowing. Xia Hui curled up on the ground. Xia Hui's aura was completely restrained and sealed. It was as if Xia Hui had been sealed into an invisible container. The connection between the inside and the outside was completely severed. This wasn't a knockdown or an extermination. This was a seal. In a way that he couldn't understand at all, this was a B-rank psychic. Kitano Sakuto didn't know what he was feeling right now. He turned to look at his employer and tried to converse with the soul deep within the frame of his body and soul. Don't go too far. The words squeezed out from his throat proved that this head bodyguard was completely at his wit's end. Was it too far? Of course, Luonan knew that Yukawa Aisuk's 7 orifices were bleeding. If it wasn't for the support of his will, Yukawa Aisuk's situation would have been even worse than Xia Hui on the ground. Luonan had forcefully reversed the structure of the Fusang tree just now, causing the power that Luonan transmitted to him to be a bit excessive. With the strength of Yukawa Aisuk's frame of body and soul, this wave of power was enough to cause serious injuries. But Luonan wasn't going to feel apologetic. If Yukawa Aisuk knew the role he should play in this world and stayed in his position, he might be able to live for a few more years. Under the influence of Luonan's will, Yukawa Aisuk's bloodshot and murky eyes adjusted slightly. He stared at Kitano Sakuto without saying a word. Kitano Sakuto's fleshy face twitched a few times. The ominous glint in his eyes finally dimmed. He waved his hand weakly. The 2 bodyguards who had been restraining Yukawa Aisuk's body were now stiff. They stared at their boss with wide eyes. When they saw the gesture, they felt as if they had been granted amnesty and quickly backed away. One of them even tripped over Xia Hui, who was on the ground, and almost fell down. Yukawa Aishuk slowly got up amidst this bewildered atmosphere. He bowed slightly to the people in the first-class cabin. Let's call it a day. My abrupt visit has caused inconvenience to everyone. Please forgive me. No. Please don't mind it. The Maikawa undersecretary made an example of himself. He bowed 90 degrees to Yukawa Aishuk. Please don't mind the dishonorable role I played in this incident. Yeah. Please don't mind it. You're too kind. I don't want to die. The first-class cabin was a boiling cauldron of voices. While everyone was expressing their stance or venting their emotions, Yukawa Aishuk's bloody and swollen face turned to the back. It was the entrance to the first-class cabin. Sir, you can't do this. You can't go up. The air stewardess's voice was urgent and trembling. It was rare for her to fulfill her duty, but it was pointless. The sealed partition door opened. A middle-aged man dressed in a suit and leather shoes walked in. He looked like a business elite. The man's face was flushed red. His feet were a bit floaty. It was as if he was drunk. However, his eyes were very bright. When he cast his gaze, it was as if the sun was shining down from the sky. Chapter 840. The drunk business elite pushed himself up from the VIP seat and moved over step by step. His fluttering footsteps and exceptionally bright eyes were completely different from normal, but he naturally formed an inexplicable harmony with the other abnormal creature on this side. At the same time, he also separated the other relatively normal fellows from him. It was this kind of situation that reduced the difficulty of understanding Yukawa Aishuk's nagging and complaints. A smart person like the Maeda Vice Officer of Affairs instinctively discovered the conflicting and uneasy factors. But he couldn't retract his prawn-like body for a while. He awkwardly froze there. What was even worse was that Yukawa Aishuk and the others were in the middle of the first-class cabin. The drunkard who came up later had to pass by a group of people if he wanted to get there. This included the Maeda Vice Officer of Affairs. The drunkard didn't give the Maeda Vice Officer of Affairs a chance to think deeply before he passed by. He even said, "Excuse me." A surprisingly dry and hot palm pressed down on the former Vice Secretary of Affairs' head, borrowing a little strength to continue moving forward. As for the former Vice Secretary of Affairs, he had turned from a bent prawn into cooked prawn meat. His entire body was paralyzed on the ground and he had lost consciousness. The sudden collapse of the Maeda Vice Officer of Affairs didn't cause panic among the people around him. In fact, as these two extraordinary people gradually approached each other, any strange situation seemed to be within reason. Moreover, the drunkard was still talking, attracting most of the attention. My job is not up to standard. The number of devout believers is limited, and the ability users are even more scarce. Losing even one is a loss. Your drastic measures are very beautiful, but they are also giving me a difficult problem. His tone and wording were ordinary. Only the content of his words required others to think carefully. But even a person with a brain ischemia could understand at this time that another big shot had arrived. Yukawa Aishuk stood next to his seat. He stared at the newcomer and didn't say anything. He just sighed. On the other side, Bai Xinyan glanced at the unconscious mountain-back Xia Hui on the ground. She didn't know the details of the drastic measures, but she could tell from common sense that the most suitable target for the new big shot soul wasn't a business elite coming from business class. It was Xia Hui on the mountain-back. These twists and turns only served to confirm that Luonan's methods were brilliant, and he possessed considerable foresight. Of course, if this big shot wanted to come over, it was impossible to stop him. At most, it would just be a few more unlucky people. The drunkard said something that seemed to be clear, but it wasn't. Then he wandered off. It was not until then that the personal secretary of the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs had the courage to help his superior. But at this moment, he only lifted up a sleeve and half of the Vice Secretary of State Affairs, who was lying on the ground. The skin and flesh under the clothes seemed to have been put through several fires in a steamer, and the inside was almost melted. Ah! The sharp sound of the broken strings of reason turned into a screech of pain that came out of the secretary's throat. The future senior political official, who graduated from a first-class university, worked in a first-class department and received first-class training, immediately peed his pants. His body bounced up a few centimeters and fell on the corpse of the Vice Minister of Maikawa. He lost consciousness. The screams, the strange smell, and the disfigured corpse. The sensory stimulation that came together and exploded in an instant finally tore apart the numb atmosphere caused by the high tension. No matter how strange the previous events were, they were far from being able to compare to the impact of the horror of death right before their eyes. The first-class cabin was in chaos. Almost everyone was retreating, fleeing, and running as far as they could. The relatively spacious first-class cabin was filled with a dozen headless flies. In other words, they could be ignored if they wanted to. After the drunkard touched the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs, he did not touch anyone else. It was as if the drunkard was just an accident. The drunkard smoothly made his way to the periphery of the small circle around Yukawa Aishuk. Most of the people in this circle were bodyguards. They were all professionals. They saw how this drunkard deprived the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs of his life, and now he was right in front of them. The more they understood the inconceivable things, the more they understood how terrifying this person, or the consciousness that was parasitic on this person's body, was. They also wanted to escape, but their leader, Kitano Sweto, did not respond. They hesitated and lost the chance to escape. They could only desperately shrink their bodies and try to put as much distance as possible between them and the drunkard. In this way, Yukawa Aishuk's protective wall was as good as non-existent. As the head of the bodyguards, Kitano Sweto still did not respond. In fact, he was probably one of the most dumbfounded people in the first-class cabin. When the drunkard was less than 2 meters away from him, he could already feel the abnormally high temperature. Only then did he wake up from his dream. He hurriedly and cautiously bowed. It's you? Kitano Sukito wasn't tall to begin with, and his bow made him even shorter. Therefore, the drunkard naturally ignored him, but his footsteps that had been moving forward also stopped there. There was no response from the other side. Kitano Sweto did not even dare to move his bent body. Not only him, but the people around him who had been influenced by what he saw and heard also instinctively bowed, each more obedient and humble than the last. There was also Bai Xinyan. She also bowed, her eyebrows drooping, and naturally held her breath. Outside the cabin, there was chaos as if a bomb had gone off, but inside the cabin, everyone was as silent as cicadas in winter. Between these two completely different scenes, the only similarity was probably the huge tension created by terror and absurdity, and the heart-wrenching pain that tore at people's hearts. Amidst the implicit and explicit agitation that tore at his heart, the drunkard spoke again. His tone was still very flat, but the information that came out of his mouth was like a flame that had finally burned through a curtain. It was a hot stream that rushed at his face. I am Hayaki. Kitano Sweto, Bai Xinyan, and the group of bodyguards subconsciously lowered their bodies a little more to show their reverence for this title. Yukawa Aishuk's mouth twitched. Hayaki. Pope? In the entire first-class cabin, only Yukawa Aishuk kept his body relatively straight. Of course, those who knew the truth knew that it was not the body that was straight, but the external soul that was supporting the body. The Pope of Hayaki, who had descended with the body of a believer, maintained a calm tone. It seemed that the slightest fluctuation could break the balance that had been maintained until now. Young man, you have a tendency to refuse communication. You are very hostile toward the Amaterasu order. The Pope of Hayaki was stating a fact. For the logic behind the fact to be established, more details needed to be filled in. This was equivalent to a kind of interrogation. So Yukawa Aishuk opened his mouth to say, "Hee." Luo Nan had no intention of responding. He just used Yukawa Aishuk's eyes and ears as well as a wider and richer medium, to seriously observe and perceive, and to make adjustments. He adjusted himself to the best possible state. At this time, the first-class cabin that was hit by a terror bomb had already been lucky enough to rush out. But at the same time, they allowed the destruction of the terror bomb to spread to a larger area. Not a single person in the business or economy class was spared. Even the cockpit. The captain and the others should have already known about the unforeseen event that happened in the first-class cabin. They had not reacted before, but after a few minutes of delay, their reaction suddenly affected the entire airship. This colossus high up in the sky suddenly lowered its altitude and tilted. Although it quickly returned to normal, it still caused a group of people in the first-class cabin who did not have their seatbelts fastened to be in a rather sorry state. 2 bodyguards who only cared about bowing fell to the ground. They grabbed the handrails beside them with all their might to prevent themselves from crashing into the terrifying drunkard in front of them. At this moment, their hearts were about to explode. Bai Xinyan's body swayed, but she quickly regained her balance. She glanced outside the porthole. She didn't know when, but the airship had already sunk into the hazy layer of clouds. Smoke billowed outside the porthole, mixing with the curtain of night over the Pacific Ocean. As the 2 people at the center of the incident, whether it was Yukawa Aishuk or the drunkard, they were still mere mortals. They did not have the ability to take root in the swaying airship. During this period they were swaying left and right, but there was still a conversation going on between them. It was mainly the Pope of Baiji who spoke. He even changed the direction of the conversation. Your spiritual configuration design is very good, but the spiritual realm is not a safe place. The higher you build now, the harder you will fall in the future. Is that so? Yukawa Aishuk replied casually. If the back of his head had not hit the outer shell of the space cabin next to him, he would have sounded more like a gentleman. The drunkard supported himself on the outer shell of the space cabin. He was barely able to maintain his image. At least his words were steady. Young people can be unscrupulous, but they should always think about the suffering in the future. As if you know anything. We can discuss and communicate. These people's original intentions were mostly the same, but they were too stupid and arrogant. Then you are cunning and sinister, right? The airship returned to normal. Most of the people in the chaotic first-class cabin were still in a state of shock. The last round of dialogue, especially the one with the Pope of Baiji, had a seriously low intake and digestion. Comparatively speaking, Luo Nan had borrowed Yukawa Aishuk's mouth to reveal his emotions. They were very straightforward and easy to understand. It was very hard to accept. The other side was an extraordinary. Even though he had borrowed the power of his believers to descend in an incomplete form, his authority ranking in the inner world and the entire earth had been in the top 10 for many years. He was even in the top 5. This was especially true in the eyes of Kitano Sakudo and the other ability users who were registered in Sakura City. The Pope of Baiji and the Amaterasu order that he represented were like the vault of heaven that covered the skies above Sakura City. They were like the sun that brought about changes. Luo Nan's attitude, they could not see Luo Nan behind Yukawa Aishuk, but they could see the drunkard on the other side laughing softly. Oh my, can you tell? Yeah. Sakura City is too close. Yukawa Aishuk's body fell to the ground as soon as he finished speaking. (22:17:45). After confirming the time, the Pope finally moved the puppet and continued to move forward. He passed by a few trembling bodyguards as well as Yukawa Aishuk and Yamakabe Xiaohui who had fallen to the ground. Finally he adjusted his posture and sat on the seat that Yukawa Aishuk was sitting on. After sitting down he no longer had to worry about maintaining his balance. His body language was more relaxed and he was more like the one Bai Xinyan was familiar with, except for his face. While Bai Xinyan was evaluating the situation in her mind, the gaze from the other side was cast over again. Bai Xinyan also remembered that she had not yet answered the question of the Pope of Baiji. She tried to organize her words, but the other side asked again without a care in the world, I mean Chiji's move just now, how is it different from the feeling of the white nightmare a few days ago? Bai Xinyan seemed to be able to hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. She could almost hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. Bai Xinyan was no longer surprised. She just couldn't understand why the Pope of the 100 Assemblies would suddenly ask such a completely unrelated question. The White Nightmare, May 7th, Osaka time, was an accident that affected the entire world. It was still rippling across the Pacific Ocean to this day, and was still in the ascendant. Because she was in the Eastern Hemisphere at that time, Bai Xinyan did not feel too much about it. Presumably, the Pope of the 100 Communities also knew. He was probably asking for the opinion of the person behind her. Bai Xinyan suddenly realized that she needed to adjust the priority of the White Nightmare incident. For the Pope of the 100 Communities to specifically ask about it, the impact on the inner world was no different from the Light of the Polar Domain incident at the end of last year. However, the Pope of the 100 Communities was destined to be disappointed. Bai Xinyan bowed and replied, Xinyan's skills are insufficient, and my memory of that day is also blurred. It's difficult to compare. The Pope of the 100 Communities did not show any obvious disappointment or anger. Even if there was, it would not show on the puppet's face. In the time it took for these 2 or 3 sentences to be exchanged, the powerful light that illuminated everything had already disappeared. The outside of the porthole was still bright, as if they could no longer return to the natural nighttime. However, under the illumination of the bright light, the roiling clouds in the sky seemed to be even denser. Even though they were illuminated by the strong light, they still slapped against the porthole, changing shape and reminding people. They were still tens of thousands of feet high in the sky, still one of the areas with the densest concentration of water vapor in the world. Bai Xinyan noticed the changes outside the porthole, and unconsciously became somewhat absent-minded. Up until now, this area had not experienced too obvious of an impact or turbulence, but just by looking at the interaction between the strong light and the sea of clouds, she could draw some conclusions and judgments. At this moment, she heard the Pope of the 100 Communities sigh, "The condensation ring, truly a divine technique that should not have appeared on Earth." Bai Xinyan shivered slightly and turned her gaze back, just in time to see the slightly red eyes of the Pope of the 100 Communities puppets. The latter swept a glance over her body, but finally focused on her side. Bai Xinyan subconsciously followed the Pope of the 100 Communities' focus, and her gaze fell on her own feet. It was a suitcase that was lying flat in front of her seat. This thing was originally placed neatly on the inside of the seat, but because the airship had lost its balance and was in the process of righting itself, it had fallen out. "This is a mimicry generator." The Pope of the 100 Communities' voice was very certain, and he even used the puppet's toe to kick the unconscious Yukawa Isuke on the ground. He made a last-minute report, but there was no follow-up. His intentions are clear as day. Next to him, Kitano Sakito's eyelids were already twitching because of the Pope of the 100 Communities' actions, and he unconsciously shivered when he heard this. He opened his mouth to explain, but his mouth opened and closed a few times, but he did not have the strength to make a sound. Bai Xinyan, on the other hand, smiled. Otherwise, he would say that His Majesty is magnanimous. As soon as she finished speaking, the torrential rain and distorted light slapped against the porthole and the outer armor of the airship. In response, there was a dull explosion outside, and the hoarse noise of the airship's structure creaking and disorderly. The people on the airship could even feel the obvious drift. The surging force and the strong light and clouds pushed the airship sideways for some distance. There was no doubt that from the cockpit to the economy cabin, there was another wave of exclamations and howls. The Pope of the 100 Communities looked at his watch again. 20 minutes and 4 seconds. "Turn it on, we'll take a look." Chapter 842. Isn't that inappropriate? Bai Xinyan did not refuse. She was just puzzled. Regardless of how Luonan managed to deal with the encirclement and interception of true gods for over 2 minutes, it was easy to imagine that the area where the two sides wrestled was not on the material plane. On the mental plane, it was undoubtedly the Abyss region. The mimicry map generator produced a mimicry map of the mental sea. As its name implied, it could only be used in the mental sea. There was an insurmountable distance between it and the main battlefield in the Abyss region. Moreover, this was just a simulator. The lag was quite strong. It was not suitable for use in actual combat. The Pope of Chiji did not speak again. He just used the puppet's scarlet eye to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Bai Xinyan was not going to be stubborn about this issue. She shrugged, bent over, and placed the suitcase back on the seat. She opened the suitcase, turned it on, and connected it to the projector. It was certainly not as effective as the one on Isuke Yukawa's private airship, but the dense bubble scene still appeared. Bai Xinyan swept her eyes over the various parameters displayed in the projection area. She spoke truthfully, "The debugging will take some time." There was another part of her that she did not say. Perhaps this high-level interception battle would have ended before the debugging was completed. The Pope of Chiji still did not speak. The puppet that carried his consciousness even narrowed its eyes. It looked like it was taking a nap. Of course, it was more likely that it was sensing the situation of the battle outside the airship. Bai Xinyan's communication was fruitless. She could only settle her mind and proceed with the debugging process bit by bit. But just as she said, this was not a problem that could be solved in a minute or two. On the other hand, the curtain of intense light outside the airship grew more and more intense. Faint rumbling sounds of thunder could be heard. At first, it sounded like it was hundreds of kilometers away, but in the blink of an eye, it was within reach. It shook the airship's window until it hummed. It seemed as if it would collapse and disintegrate in the next moment. It's been over 3 minutes. Bai Xinyan paid more attention to the battle outside. At first glance, the momentum of this battle was astonishing, but in fact, in terms of intensity, it was far from the strongest. The rhythm of the explosions was intermittent, and there was a high probability that it was a chase, but once the chase started, it would be endless. Was there a limit to being a true god? Or was Luonan too cunning? Or perhaps, "You haven't finished debugging yet?" The one who spoke was Kitano Sakuto. The head bodyguard walked over quietly and spoke in a low voice. His original tough and professional demeanor was almost gone. Without the hint from the Pope of Hyakanji, Kitano Satoto would not have come here just to investigate. After all, it was just a matter of opening his mouth. Did the Pope of Hyakanji need to put on airs like this? Bai Xinyan's drifting consciousness came back. She turned around to see what was going on. However, Kitano Sukido happened to block her line of sight. She could only exchange glances with Kitano Sukido and shake her head slightly, signaling him to pay attention to the surrounding environment. At this time, the cries from the business class and economy class had vaguely spread to the upper deck. Along with the shapeless corpses and unconscious and limp bodies, it looked like a scene from the end of the world. The collective emotional state is in a mess, and the spiritual sea is in chaos. The changes are too intense. Moreover, the computing power of a portable instrument is difficult to support the speed and precision of analysis at the same time. It's not suitable for actual combat. This was said to Kitano Sutodo, but it was also an explanation for the Pope of Hakuji. I'll bring it over. Bai Xinyan did not understand at first. Kitano Sutodo's eyelids drooped, and his eyes were almost invisible, but his movements were direct and clear. He reached out and picked up the mimicry generator, that was still in a state of adjustment. He held it up respectfully, turned around, and took 2 steps to present it to the Pope. At this time, Bai Xinyan finally saw the current state of the Pope of Hakuji. The puppet that he had possessed was sitting in a somewhat casual posture. His legs were spread wide, his elbows on his knees, and his upper body was supported. However, the curve of his back was still bent, and his head was also drooping. His right hand naturally clasped his left wrist, and his fingertips tapped unconsciously on his wrist. He looked like he was thinking but also looked a little tired. As for the mimicry generator that was already in his hand, he did not pay attention to it immediately. He still maintained his posture and no one knew what he was thinking. Compared to the image of a god and its spokesperson that could not be looked at directly and could not be communicated with, this kind of behavior that was similar to a real life was more or less a buffer for the fragile hearts of the surrounding bodyguards. Therefore, probably because of Kitano Sutodo's arrangement, the bodyguards began to work. They were trying to settle Yukawa Aisuke and Yamashita Xiaohui, who were stacked together at the feet of the Pope of Hakuji. At present, they had already carried Yukawa Aisuke away and placed him on the front row seat. They were about to carry Yamashita Xiaohui away when the tip of a polished leather boot suddenly tapped on his side shoulder. The leather boot belonged to the Pope of Hakuji. Puppet. Stop. Kitano Sutodo, who was still holding the mimicry generator, reacted quickly and called for it to stop immediately. Everyone's movements froze for a moment. Only the Pope of Hakuji controlled the puppet to extend its hand and use it to replace the tip of the boot to press on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder. Bai Xinyan narrowed her eyes. Although the entire process was not long, she could see, and the others could also see, that the Pope puppet's fingertip was clearly trembling. Even when it pressed on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder, it only calmed down a little. She roughly understood why the Pope of Hakuji was putting on airs. For an extraordinary high-intensity output from more than 1,400 kilometers away was not that easy to deal with. Without a solid fulcrum, the puppet had strength but was unable to use it. It also needed to perform micromanipulation to avoid bursting the small water pipe. From this, it could be seen that the majority of the Pope of Hakuji's energy was consumed on this. Even so, the problem of accelerated depreciation was unavoidable. The puppet's outstretched hand maintained a pressing posture on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder for over 10 seconds. During this time, the puppet's skin was clearly red. Fine sweat seeped out of its pores, and there were even faint specks of blood. It was only because the puppet had a drunken appearance that it was not overly eye-catching. But even with such strength, Yamashita Xiaohui didn't show any reaction. This technique. Bai Xinyan lowered her eyes. She made a hypothesis based on this. If the Pope of Hakuji had the support of a B-rank psychic like Yamashita Xiaohui, then the Pope of Hakuji would certainly be much more relaxed than he was right now. But Yamashita Xiaohui had fainted and he seemed to be quite heavy. It was hard to say who would be at a disadvantage if they were to fight a protracted battle like this. TSK. Luo Nan's grasp of the situation and his control of the details was much more experienced than imagined. It was as if he was exchanging blows with extraordinaries from time to time. Where did he accumulate this experience and insight from? At this time, Bai Xinyan heard the puppet's breathing. It was as if there was a tube of iron sand in its throat, making a rustling sound. She relied on her many years of experience in researching the human body. Her first judgment was that Xiaohui had developed severe symptoms of laryngeal edema. Eliminating the cause of infection, his heart and kidney functions were most likely abnormal. Under the strong pressure, the internal organs of the human body had suffered irreversible damage, and the damage was continuing to worsen. There was no possibility of relief. Bai Xinyan was able to discern so much information due to her personal ability level. The others didn't have this ability. They could only passively wait. In particular, the bodyguard who was preparing to move Yamashita Xiahui maintained a half-squatting posture. He didn't dare to move. He waited for over 10 seconds and all he got was the Pope puppet's sigh. He felt a dry sensation suddenly press against the top of his head. He seemed to hear a cry of alarm, or perhaps it was the sound of the explosion outside the window. Then, it was meaningless to him. All sounds in the first-class cabin disappeared. The Pope puppet's sigh also disappeared. At the same time, the symptoms of laryngeal edema also disappeared. At the very least, it was temporarily alleviated. The price was the bodyguard who had fallen onto Yamashita Xiahui. That person's skin and flesh were already limp. There was no breath left. The way he died was no different from the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs. The surrounding bodyguards all had deathly pale faces. As full-time members of the Yuchuan family, they had seen quite a few situations of internal handling. But this kind of situation where they were treated as a power bank was truly unprecedented. The important question was, whose turn would it be next? The hearts of the people were in turmoil, but now was not the time to pacify them. Whether it was Bai Xinyan or Kitano Sukito, neither of them cared about these things. From their perspective, what they needed to pay more attention to was the new clear instructions the Pope of 100 Gatherings made after helping the puppet catch its breath. The hand that had just reaped a life flipped over. Its palm faced upwards and it hooked its finger. Kitano Sukito's reaction was maintained at a high standard. He bent down again and, with absolute respect, handed over the mimicry generator. It was also at this time that he saw a cluster of greenish-black veins appear on the palm. It looked like the expanding capillaries under the skin, but it was more like the shadow of a tree with branches growing horizontally. Within the dark veins, there was clearly light flowing, filled with a different kind of vitality. But just thinking about its most likely source made one shudder. Kitano Sukito instinctively wanted to keep his distance from the Pope puppet. He wanted to retreat after completing his task. But the latter had no intention of taking over. Perhaps it felt that the distance and height were just right, so it simply used Kitano Sukito as a table. It stretched its hand over the control area of the device and began to operate it. Kitano Sukito's pupils dilated as he watched the Pope puppet's fingertips switch back and forth between the virtual interface and the physical buttons. Especially with the appearance of a business elite, he looked quite professional when he did such actions. But as long as one thought about the true identity, status, and image of the Pope, there was an element of absurdity in it. And as the Pope puppet operated, the mimicry image of the spiritual C, in the projection area connected to the device began to change repeatedly. The colorful water droplets constantly adjusted the angle of presentation, and at the same time the colors quickly faded, forming a general grayish-white base tone. Kitano Sukito did not quite understand what this change meant. He subconsciously turned to look at Bai Xinyan, but he saw that Bai Xinyan's gaze had drifted to Yukawa Aishuk, who had just been seated in the front row. Bai Xinyan also noticed Kitano Sukito's gaze, but she had no intention of explaining. She moved her gaze away from Yukawa Aishuk and switched back and forth between the device and the projection area. She knew, and she had even explained to Yukawa Aishuk earlier, that this kind of change was a result of the repetitive spiritual waves in the surrounding area and the changes that had already become a routine. It was presented as the regular background radiation. This was also a sign that the initial analysis of the mimicry picture had been completed. Last time in Osaka, Bai Xinyan had spent at least 20 minutes to achieve this step. Even if the sensing range was wider this time and the processing of more data, the difference was too obvious in comparison. Bai Xinyan could confirm that this device was directly sent over from the Deep Blue world. It was a product of the laboratory and it had not been put into the market. Perhaps this was the only one on Earth. Then, where did the super operating ability of the Pope of the 100 Collections come from? Was it born with knowledge? Such thoughts could be written into the scriptures of the Church, but in the real world, it was better to use reasoning. From the simple background of the device, if the problem was not in the application or the circulation, then the problem could only be in the research and development stage. According to her understanding, the Apocalypse Laboratory had obtained inspiration from Luonan's cage theory to develop this device. They hoped to use it as a key tool to break the barriers that ordinary people had to the spiritual plane. They wanted to make it into a commercial hit and lay the foundation for the next step of their grand plan. The so-called return on investment, the small profit operation, and the like were just excuses to deal with investors like Yukawa Aishuk. As for what the grand plan was, Bai Xinyan did not know the full picture. She only heard that the laboratory attached great importance to it, and that even Li Wei was deeply involved in the research and development. But now it seemed that Li Wei was not the only one participating in the research and development. The relationship between the Apocalypse Laboratory and the Amaterasu Order was no longer concealed. Yukawa Aishuk had indeed played the worst trick. Focus. A low and hoarse voice flowed out from the throat of the Pope puppet. It was directed at Bai Xinyan. Your Majesty? You'll be the one operating from now on. Make sure that the interface is maintained on this baseline. The Pope puppet did not even raise its head. The arrangement was a matter of course. The slight loss of voice at the end proved that the organ tissue of the throat had not completely recovered. It was impossible for it to recover. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Perhaps it was because of this that the Pope of the 100 Collections did not play any tricks. She spoke very clearly. Chenju exerts force through the abyss region. Distance isn't a problem, but it is very difficult to accurately lock onto Luonan. Luonan previously reversed-sealed the Magatama configuration and Xiaohui on the back of the mountain, cutting off our path of descent. His methods are brilliant, but it is hard to avoid revealing traces. We have grabbed onto a piece of his tail, but it is too insubstantial. It jumps back and forth between the material plane and the mental plane. Chenju probed down from the abyss region to the material plane, causing a large loss in precision. He needs me to act as the signal tower's relay gain. Only then can he encircle and intercept Luonan. Luonan knows all of this. He will most likely do something. The Pope of the 100 Collections operated the apparatus as she explained. In this way, Bai Xinyan had a clear understanding of the distorted bubbles of colorful light that gradually grew on the ash-gray background. Frankly speaking, it was a nesting doll structure. The innermost layer of the bubble was the signal tower of the Pope puppet. It appeared weak and fleeting, as if it could collapse at any time. The middle layer warped and fluctuated, flickering indefinitely. Specks of light would appear from time to time, but they did not form a shape. This was most likely the impact of the battle between the two sides. The details were no longer something that the mimicry diagram could analyze. The outermost layer was supported by a bubble. This bubble was much more stable, forming a boundary that was not a boundary. Perhaps this was the control domain of a true god's extraordinary power? Of course, everything displayed here was just a mimicry on the mental C-plane. Let's not talk about accuracy. In essence, it was just the area swept by the aftermath. The main battlefield between Luonan and a true god was still the abyss region. Understand? His Majesty is using himself as bait. Bai Xinyan was just being polite. The Pope had only used a pious believer puppet. It was not even an ability user. How could it be considered bait? If Luonan really wanted to pull the firewood out from the bottom of the cauldron, then the true unlucky ones would be them, the passengers of the airship, if there was a slight deviation in the application of power. However, this possibility was meaningless to the Pope of the 100 Collections. What he paid attention to was on a completely different level than the others. The puppet raised its head and stared at Bai Xinyan with its scarlet eyes. Protect the apparatus. Collect data. If Chenju is unable to obtain the results of the battle, this place needs to be maintained for at least 200 seconds. The mimicry generator will transmit the data to the laboratory's cloud. We need to clearly see his foundation. We need to clearly see what he's hiding behind his back. Yes. Bai Xinyan agreed. But she had a feeling that the Pope of the 100 Collections was not talking to her. Instead, he was shouting at Luonan, whose whereabouts were unknown within the boundless clouds. It was like a threat, but it was also like a lure. Chapter 843. Lu arrived at Luo Nan's rented studio on the dot. Even though Luo Nan hadn't had a normal work and rest schedule for several days in a row, as long as she was his personal secretary, she absolutely couldn't neglect the morning and evening work. She first pressed the intercom outside the workshop, but there was no response. Only then did she verify her fingerprint to enter. The lights of the workshop were on, and the lights and shadows of the virtual work area were fluctuating. Luo Nan sat behind the workbench with one hand supporting his cheek. His figure was frozen. He should be concentrating on his work. However, when he took 2 more steps forward and took a closer look, he discovered that the man's eyes were closed and his breathing was slow. He had actually fallen asleep while maintaining this posture. He probably couldn't take it anymore after working continuously. Lu didn't dare to wake Luo Nan up. She just scanned the workshop to see if there was anything that needed to be cleaned up. That moving shelf didn't exist before. Now it was placed in the middle of the room. It was very conspicuous. Something must have been placed there earlier. It was likely that the veteran had been here before. Lu moved the mobile rack to the corner and quietly walked to the workbench. She didn't dare to touch the tools and instruments on the stage. She could only pick up some small things and even took photos to locate them. She didn't want anything to go wrong and she couldn't recover them. It was also at this time that she glanced at the virtual work area. The picture she saw was very familiar. It was like a bottomless sea or a storm on the surface of the sea. It was thick and colorful and the structure was chaotic. In fact, it was made up of 2 overlapping pictures. 2 psychic diagrams. The reason why Lu was certain of this was because she had seen Luo Nan dismantle and integrate before. Moreover, most of the things she had been busy with recently came from this. It was hard for Lu to notice such a complicated and profound diagram. However, she noticed that the whole picture was fluctuating rhythmically, as if it was an interwoven picture of the ocean that was gradually seeping into the real world and becoming a substantial existence. Lu was startled, but she soon realized that it might be a misconception. This was because there was a certain amount of distortion and refraction of light in the surroundings of the sleeping Luo Nan. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that the air was fluctuating, resulting in an illusion. Luo Nan wasn't resting. He was cultivating, right? Was there a need to be so desperate? Lu couldn't help but recall the letter she had sent to Mrs. Halder, which described her doubts and judgment. Luo Nan, this new boss of hers, had his sights set on the target. The enemy he targeted far exceeded the scope of what should have been. This forced him to never stop moving forward. Instead, he seized every moment and opportunity to improve himself. He was as taut as a humming bowstring. He might shoot a deadly arrow at any time, but he might also snap on his own. Lu sighed. Her breath was still lingering in her mouth when a rustling sound rang out at the same time. Behind the workbench, the chair on Luo Nan's body suddenly collapsed without any warning. The wooden body of the chair and the soft cushion on the seat disintegrated into fine dust, and some of the plastic and metal parts were twisted and cracked. At the same time, they were restrained by a certain force, which erased the kinetic energy of the disintegration. They fell in a straight line and fell to the ground. Lu was startled. "Sir." The moment she spoke those words, she felt that there were too many similar exclamations. But when the impact came, what could she do? And this time the shout had some effect. Luo Nan opened his eyes at this time. As for his body, it floated in midair, maintaining its original natural state without any undulation. "Sir?" Lu called out in a probing manner. "Oh, you're here." Luo Nan looked as if he had just woken up. He floated in midair, unfolded his body and stretched his waist. But his eyes were as bright as stars. He didn't have the hazy appearance of someone who had just woken up. Lu was very curious as to what Luo Nan had been doing, but she couldn't really ask. She could only go with the flow and say, "It's almost 10:30. Sir, do you want to go back and rest?" "Oh, it doesn't matter if I rest or not. I can't stay here for now. It wasn't easy to calibrate the equipment. I might have to start all over again." "Really?" Lu responded with her mouth, but in her mind she thought of the fluctuating air around Luo Nan. Luo Nan's feet didn't touch the ground. His body turned a few times and he sat on the wheelchair next to the workbench. He entered into the disabled mode, which required someone to serve him. Lu's eyes were still engraved with the image of his natural turning and turning, of his figure that didn't have the slightest trace of smoke and fire. It was unknown how much more brilliant it was than when he used the electromagnetic configuration to propel his fleshly body to float in midair. But when she thought about it in detail, only 2 weeks had passed in between. This degree of improvement. Lu sighed silently. She consciously went behind the wheelchair and did what she needed to do. But when she exerted force, the wheelchair actually became heavy and sluggish. It didn't move at all. What's wrong with this? I almost forgot. I can't take a car in my current situation. Let's walk back. What's your situation? Lu finally found the opportunity to seek knowledge and dispel her doubts. She subconsciously made a guess. Did you have another breakthrough in your cultivation? No. I was just playing a game. You can't take it seriously. Chapter 844. The distance from the studio located at the center of the peaceful trade market to the yacht dock was approximately 5 kilometers. Whether it was Luonan or Lu, neither of them took this distance seriously. The two slowly walked forward, one in front and one behind, amidst the sound of rubber wheels and high heels hitting the road surface. Lu still did not understand Luonan's words. However, as they walked, she naturally assumed the position of a personal secretary. She held the handle behind the wheelchair, even though it did not have any practical meaning. Lu was still pondering over Luonan's theory of playing games. She could not understand the logic behind it no matter how hard she tried. She pondered for a kilometer before she heard Luonan's voice. You were once the manager of Frost River Reality. How do you deal with those guys who cheat in games? This. How do you deal with those guys who cheat and want to PK with real people? Lu stared blankly for a few seconds before she finally decided to say what was on her mind. Basically, you deal with them by suspending their accounts. In some cases, you'll use security and the police. Sometimes, you'll even apply to the SCA to lower the social privileges of those people. You'll ban them from entering relevant places and so on. It's quite difficult to find the SCA at that level. Luonan laughed and sighed. It was just as he said. Right now he was playing a game. When it came to game skills, he and the two from the Amaterasu order could not determine who was superior due to the short amount of time they had spent together. However, Luonan occupied two advantages. One was the advantage of misplaced information. Luonan knew how the true God and the Pope participated. He knew their methods and calculations. Though those two had locked onto a Luonan, it was only an illusory phantom. An enormous error had appeared in their critical judgment. The other advantage was the bandwidth advantage. Luonan relied on the ability of the Soul Cloak to cover the entire world. He occupied an absolute advantage in terms of energy conduction and utilization. He also sealed off the preset signal tower a step earlier. While the true God and the Pope were still calculating whether or not there was a signal, Luonan relied on the ubiquitous water molecules to construct the global Internet of Things. He enjoyed the convenience of zero-time delay. Luonan did not know how he would lose if he simply played games under these conditions. The problem lay in the fact that the Pope and the true God were sore losers. They didn't really want to PK with Luonan's gaming techniques. Their goal from the very beginning was to lock onto Luonan's position in reality through the game, within the clouds. This was to prepare for the offline real-life PK. This was very shameless. From Luonan's perspective, it didn't matter whether he won or lost the game. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of warning by Xinyan and Yukawa Aishuk. But if the two from the Amaterasu order locked onto Luonan's true location and confirmed that the target was hiding in their base, they would not be able to win. Lu and Snake Tongue, who were by Luonan's side, as well as Old Hand and the group of vagrants who had a close relationship with Luonan's grandfather, would most likely not be able to survive once the conflict erupted. From another point of view, the reason why the true gods and the Pope still had some misgivings in their headquarters, Ban City, and had to travel over 1,000 kilometers to verify their findings was also because of the existence of this source of interference. In their eyes, there should be a difference between Luonan and the source of interference. Especially since Luonan was following closely behind the airship. The influence of the spacetime interference still existed in Ban City. This was more or less a new piece of evidence. At the very least, they did not think that there was no human figure riding a devil ray running and hiding in the hazy sea and sky 1,500 kilometers away. Even if they had their suspicions, they still needed further confirmation. With this analysis, the things Luonan needed to do were quite clear. He needed to maintain his advantage. He needed to interfere with the verification methods of the true God and the Pope. He needed to let the existing misunderstanding continue to exist. It would be best if he stayed away from reality and created layers of confusion. He needed to lure the two off topic and have some fear. Of course, he absolutely could not overreach himself and allow the other side to grab hold of his weakness. Luonan was very cautious. It was true that he occupied a certain information advantage. But ultimately he was not sure what the two from the Amaterasu order were basing their judgment on. He did not know where they came from. Especially the true god who had run back to Ban City after screaming out that his soul had been magnetized. His understanding of the situation definitely exceeded the scope of normal Earth knowledge. Luo Nan wanted to think things over carefully, but this was not something he was good at. He could not find anyone to advise him. The conversation with Lu just now was just a joke to adjust his mood. This was the result of stuffing a belly full of secrets. Luckily, the conversation between the Pope and Bai Xinyan gave Luo Nan an opening to take advantage of the situation. Didn't they say that I was nearby? Then I'll be nearby. He would not be able to hide it sooner or later if he just fooled around in the air. He needed to add a bit more to it. During the night stroll, Luo Nan carefully combed through his thoughts in his mind. He roughly sorted out the required configuration design. Then he extended his hand and waved behind him. You still have the one I gave you last time, right? Ha! Lu, who had been stunned by Luo Nan's question, instantly became nervous. Mister, which one are you talking about? It's that fish. Luo Nan subconsciously lowered his voice when he said the three key syllables. He was a bit mysterious. The Devil Ray was a secret that absolutely could not be exposed in Ban City. Lu had a serious expression. She had never seen Luo Nan speak with this sort of tone before. Many thoughts flashed through her mind in an instant. She calmed her mind with great difficulty and lowered her voice. Yes, mister. You. Luo Nan didn't say much. He just waved his 5 fingers. His meaning was very clear. Lu immediately picked up her bag and wanted to take out the crystal ball, with the Devil Ray sealed inside. But her vigilant mentality made her remember something. She hesitated for a moment before handing over the entire purse. Her body leaned forward, and her lips nearly stuck to Luo Nan's ear as she apologized. I'll have to trouble mister to take a look. Don't take it out for now. I've had a lot of eyes these past 2 days. Oh, that's right. The Deep Blue Walker Squadron, which was his yacht's neighbor, had put in quite a bit of effort these past few days. It was a bit better in the studio, but in a public place, there might be several surveillance cameras pointing at them. It's too early to talk about this. Luo Nan reflected on himself for a moment. He readily followed the advice and opened the purse to search for his target. From his perspective, the lady's purse was more or less a small maze. He could clearly sense the location of the crystal ball, but the complicated design of the purse still tormented him quite a bit. A minute later, Luo Nan extended his hand into the Kuan bag and finally grasped the crystal ball. He felt the marvelous sensation of the crystal ball being indistinguishable between real and illusory. He also felt the instant information that belonged to the Devil Ray transmitted from the void in between layers. He made a series of fine adjustments to the configuration outline in his mind. The bitter intelligence and staff officers could only crawl on the grid and write plans to satisfy the captain's desire to dominate. Jimmy, let's wait for the news. Seeing Captain Jimmy's behavior, Minder knew that Captain Jimmy wanted to take a different approach. Therefore he tried to dissuade him. There should be a result on the airship soon. I'm just waiting and making preparations. In front of his subordinates, Captain Jimmy maintained the dignity of a supervisor. Even if the procedure is completed and we start to move from the close contact between this adulterous couple and Shouxiong, there is a high chance that they will interfere. Look, that woman is on the phone talking to her lover. Boy, show me the surveillance records from the past few days. The last sentence was again addressed to the intelligence clerk. While retrieving the information, Captain Jimmy said to the SEA's Minister O'Hara, "It would be perfect if we could get their phone records." Minister O'Hara's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond to Captain Jimmy's words and actions that violated the law. He could only pretend that he was deaf and mute. Captain Jimmy didn't force him further. Now wasn't the time to be serious. He only compared the surveillance records to find evidence for himself. From the surveillance records, our technical maniac, Mr. Mo, has been working hard in the studio for the past few days. Why couldn't he stay there tonight? Oh, and the big news on the airship just happened. All right, Captain Jimmy's every word exuded an aura of looking for trouble. This was already the consensus of everyone present, but no one dared to point it out. Captain Jimmy, on the other hand, felt good about it, so his words became more and more outrageous. This Mr. Mo.T. City still hasn't found an accurate explanation for why the Blood Flame Order's deputy high priest is so willing to be submissive. Is he actually Lady Halder's lover, or is he the result of that person's sex change? Cough cough. With outsiders around, Dor didn't want to speak carelessly and leave something that could be used against him. He tried his best to find more information. From the intelligence, the Blood Flame Order's madam has always been cold and ruthless. She's also a bit mysterious. Maybe this is her backup plan. Backup plan? She has such a high-profile backup plan? It's not that bad. Anyone under the spotlight has to expose something. Then what did he expose? Claw Island. Buddy, do you remember that place? Yes. In the few days that the operation had been stalled, the operation team could only put in more effort into intelligence work. So far, they had already obtained enough information from Mr. Neo and knew that Claw Island was the secret tunnel that the remnants of the Soul Order used to infiltrate. At the same time, they also knew that the island and the lake and the half-abandoned base on it were rented by this Mr. Mo. Chapter 846. The commercial car went back and forth, Luonan boarded the boat, the yacht left the shore, and the boat drove into the center of the lake. There were no accidents in this series of processes. They were extremely compact, without any buffer gaps. Such a rhythm was rare for Luonan, at least from Snake Tongue's point of view. Ever since they got to know each other for a long time, the impression Luonan gave her in most situations was that he spent long periods of time pondering and delving. He was in an illusory and mysterious state of emptiness. Occasionally they would interact and he would be cold and hard, piercing into the deepest depths of one's heart. The current scene was more like someone whipping him from behind or rushing to the front to fight an intense battle. Snake Tongue originally wanted to report the latest intelligence on monitoring Captain Jimmy and the others, but she couldn't find an opportunity to interrupt. After Luonan boarded the yacht, he went directly to the warehouse area. He checked the raw materials provided by Snake Tongue and confirmed that they were sufficient. He didn't say anything, but a layer of smoke spread out from his body. The temporarily separated warehouse area wasn't that big. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Yinlu, they were soon enveloped by the smoke. Their figures became hazy and indistinct. What was this? Yinlu turned her head in shock, wanting to communicate with Snake Tongue. However, the two lacked tacit understanding in the end. Snake Tongue didn't pay attention to Yinlu. She just silently watched the roiling smoke beside her, as well as the more detailed components within. Snake Tongue wasn't able to discern too many details because her psychic senses were greatly restricted within this smoke. And the more she delved into the details, the more fuzzy her probing mental senses became. It was as if countless fine blades were sliced into pieces and scattered randomly. They were turned upside down and confused. In the end, she simply doubted her usual self-logic. This feeling was terrible. More importantly, it stimulated Snake Tongue. It made her remember that she had vaguely experienced this scene before. Yes, the cloud world, the mist maze. This was the bizarre location where Luonan had attacked, oppressed, and bound Gong Chi. Snake Tongue often boasted that she was experienced and knowledgeable, but she had never seen such a bizarre and despairing world in her entire life. It was precisely there that Snake Tongue and death overlapped. Perhaps it was just a hair's breadth of difference. No matter when she thought about it, she couldn't get rid of the feeling of suffocation. It was also there that she completely lost her freedom of life. Perhaps this included the future that she could look forward to. Snake Tongue's gaze shifted and swept over Yinlu's blurry face. This woman was curiously looking around as if she didn't know anything. Chapter 847. The victim's abdomen was meaningless. Snake Tongue cleared her distracting thoughts, and her line of sight pierced through the pervasive smoke. She saw that this blurry area still had certain restrictions. After eliminating the influence of obstacles, a relatively complete circle appeared on the whole. She vaguely understood Luonan's meaning. The exoskeleton is basically equivalent to a padding, but it's also an orderly operating system. It filled in the abilities that the body didn't have and increased the power that the body didn't have. The relationship between it and the main body was equivalent to the gear set that His Excellency had mentioned before, that coupling theory. The coupling between the inside and the outside will form an organic whole, amplifying one's own strength and stirring up even greater power in the world. That's right. You were the same back then. You understood it the moment you heard it? Luonan grinned his teeth in delight. He was a bit pleasantly surprised. The corner of Snake Tongue's mouth perked up, but the curve of her lips was mostly filled with bitterness. At this moment, The magnificent power raised by the gear set that was embedded in the void surged up from the depths of his memory. Moreover, as the timeline moved forward, it became more and more majestic and unstoppable. Back then he had recklessly used his own small gear to pry open the big gear of the world. Today just his existence alone was already a marvel of the world, unfathomable and unattainable. Such a change only took the time of a nightmare in the cloud world. Perhaps this change itself was a nightmare. At this moment, Lu came in with the metal box containing the wires. "Sir?" She paused halfway through her words. Her gaze shifted between Luonan's and Snake Tongue's faces. She paused for about a second before she opened the case and displayed the relevant equipment. "The RAC wire is here." Luonan nodded slightly. He wasn't in a hurry to get into action. Instead, he continued to communicate with Snake Tongue about the corresponding concepts. "It is indeed a coupling, but there is one thing that is different from the last time. This time I don't need to pry anything. Instead, I need to merge with the big gear set of heaven and earth so that it doesn't stand out. But at the same time, I need to make my own characteristics stand out. The work of integration will be completed in the addition stage. You must fully realize the coupling effect. This is the foundation. The work of highlighting will be completed in the subtraction stage. You must highlight the sense of design. Now get ready." "Yes." Snake Tongue adjusted her breathing and took out the wire from the metal case she had already opened. She gradually understood. Luonan's conversation with her was actually to further clarify his train of thought. Therefore, during this period, the configuration design of the virtual workspace was adjusted to a certain extent. It felt more concise and clear. In comparison, Snake Tongue's operation phase was lackluster. She just appeared as an AI assistant. She followed Luonan's instructions and installed the wires in the designated locations. Snake Tongue had installed a total of over 30 wires, and they were arranged inside and outside the exoskeleton frame. They were like a mixture of neurons, muscle fibers, blood vessels, and other functional tissues. Every time a wire was installed, the exoskeleton frame would react, and it was an obvious change in shape. The muscle membrane structure produced by the transformation would also quickly cover it, making it look like a single entity. Snake Tongue didn't have the time to look at it in detail. She listened attentively to Luonan's instructions. She was engrossed in the installation and traction work. When the work was complete, she tried to look at the fruits of her labor as a whole. But she was stunned to discover that the scenery before her eyes was fading away. The smoke that practically covered the entire warehouse area was fading away without end. This wasn't a result of the leakage and decrease in concentration due to the tight seal. Instead, it corresponded to the steps of continuous adjustment. The chaotic dust within the smoke was like a jigsaw puzzle that gradually became orderly. The orderly layers gradually became clear, forming a stable and ethereal structure. It blended together with the surrounding void that she was accustomed to. The exoskeleton frame also blended inside. Within the fading smoke, the dark infrared exoskeleton, which had just pulled the wires and wrapped the muscle membrane, seemed to have been rubbed by an eraser. Its structure, color, and even substance all became faint and fuzzy. Then it disappeared one by one until it was completely hidden. In the end, only Luonan's figure remained in the middle of the warehouse area. He stood there quietly with his head slightly lowered. It seemed that he was pondering something. The smoke, the exoskeleton, and all the corresponding scenes were like an illusion. However, one only needed to see that the vast majority of the compound raw material reserves had been consumed and the empty metal case in Li's hands. Luonan knew that everything that had just happened was true without a doubt. Snake Tongue thought of Luonan's words from a few minutes ago, the large gear set that wanted to merge with heaven and earth. The merging was quite thorough. As for how Luonan was able to accomplish this, Snake Tongue really couldn't guess. The operation of this round far exceeded the scope of her knowledge structure. Snake Tongue was stunned, and Li's reaction was even greater. She blurted out a question. "Is it done?" "A portion. I still need to test it." Luonan flexed and extended his 10 fingers as he spoke. Chapter 848. Luonan didn't show any joy towards Snake Tongue's praise. He continued to twirl the muslin and responded calmly, "It can be considered a success, but the design of the spirit core is still a bit lacking." "What are they talking about?" Lu was confused. In terms of cultivation, she and Luonan really didn't have much of a tacit understanding. She was able to accept this fact, But right now she was completely excluded from Luonan and Snake Tongue's small circle. She felt far too uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, Lu adjusted her state of mind and used the most honest method to participate. "Sir, what did you just do?" "Examine the interference effect between the constructed gear set and the outside world." Luonan chose Snake Tongue's description, and the source came from himself. Seeing Li's blank expression, he explained a little more. "I hope to achieve 2 effects. Oh, it should be 3 effects. The first is that the newly constructed gear set can be seamlessly embedded into the big gear set of heaven and earth. This is basically achieved." Luonan reached out his hand and fiddled with it a few times. He didn't feel any obstruction at all. He gestured to Lu to give it a try. Lu reached out her hand in a daze, and without any obstruction she touched Luonan's chest. She subconsciously apologized and retracted her arm. However, she bumped into something along the way and her arm was locked down by a solid object, rendering her unable to move. It was also at this moment that Lu realized that there was a slight refraction in the surrounding air with a vague silhouette appearing around her arm. Exoskeleton? This is invisibility. No, it's a void layer. Lu immediately thought of the crystal ball in her bag and the devil ray swimming in it. More or less. The demonstrative clamp was released, and the exoskeleton frame was embedded back into the sandwich domain. Luonan nodded slightly. "This is my strong suit and it's the best state I can reach right now." Unfortunately, the second effect wasn't realized, the connection with the invisible yarn. This means that there are still flaws in the design of the spirit core. Lu didn't really understand this part, but she finally had a vague idea. She didn't delve into the details and continued to ask, "Then the third effect is, the game character logs into the internet." "Oh, it's long-distance mapping. We still have to try it out." Li's cognitive network almost broke again. She was stunned for 2 seconds before continuing, "Long distance? How far is it?" Before Luonan could reply, the latest news came from the intelligence channel. Lu originally didn't want to pay attention to it, but the priority of the information was higher, and it involved the kind of people that needed special attention. The relevant information was directly projected onto the retina. A local bright light phenomenon appeared over the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, Lu finally had the leeway to use her brain when it came to mundane matters. She quickly said, "I'll immediately contact D-City's side and the boss's side. I'll tell them about Mr. Mo's identity. It'll be good if we can interfere with them a bit. As for Mr. Mo..." She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Can we first leave the yacht? Temporarily avoid contact with them just like 10 days ago?" Lu made the connection to Luonan's mysterious and possibly world-shaking operation last time. It also began with leaving the yacht. "We really do need to leave." What Lu said was already within Luonan's plans. Since she mentioned it, he didn't say anything more. He simply waved his hand. "You guys keep an eye on this side. I'll go greet True God and the Pope. If things go smoothly, it shouldn't take too long." "Yes." Lu suddenly froze on the spot, and Snake Tongue wasn't any better. Luonan was truly straightforward and efficient. He simply turned around and headed outside after speaking. The warehouse's exit wasn't in front of him, but the sealed cabin wall of the yacht. The scene of the yacht's cabin wall being torn apart 10 days ago instantly flashed in Li's mind. She subconsciously opened her mouth, but before she could speak, she saw Luonan's figure pass through the rack of materials in front of the cabin wall like a phantom. He also passed through the thick cabin wall itself. There were no changes to the scene before him. The only thing missing was the living person. Chapter 849. Luonan walked at the bottom of Beishan Lake. To put it more accurately, he rode a self-made bubble to shuttle through the structure of space and time at the bottom of Beishan Lake. What he felt at this time and place was not the pressure of millions and millions of tons of water. Instead, it was the vast and boundless acceptance and rejection of the local structure of space and time that was hard to describe. Luonan slightly altered the old-fashioned analogy that Snake Tongue used. He was a temporary creation, a mutated gear set. He wanted to change his original role. He wanted to obtain more authority and occupy a more important position in the great machine and the great production line created by all living things in the world. He undoubtedly had to compete with other gear sets with similar structures, but they were even tighter and sturdier. This was an enormous challenge and it was extremely intuitive. As Luonan walked between the structure of space and time, the pressure was everywhere. It penetrated the outer layer of the spacetime bubble and acted upon the embryonic exoskeleton frame. During this time, a portion of the pressure was dispelled by his sandwich domain. Even so, he was still able to clearly hear the vibrating hum of the mutant skeletal material, which had gone through many layers of processing and forging. Occasionally the sound would be hoarse or sharp. This was a sign of damage to the material structure. This pressure far exceeded the intensity of the water pressure at the bottom of the lake. But the bubble he designed was able to withstand the initial test. It traveled in a straight line through the complex environment at the bottom of Beishan Lake. Whether it was the undercurrents surging in the water layer or the crooked and scattered ruins of the city, they were unable to create any substantial obstruction. There were also the sensitive creatures at the bottom of the lake, including the mutants. They had completely overlooked such a blank target. This was because Luonan was walking in another dimension. In a certain sense, he was a part of this world. He was a redundancy that was hard to discover within the established structure of space and time. This was a relatively conservative standby state. Only in this way could the exoskeleton frame, which was not that perfect in its workmanship, be able to endure for a period of time. Luonan earnestly sensed the feeling of being in the great gear set and the great production line of the world. Right now, he did not possess the mysterious feeling of becoming one with heaven and earth. He only had a simple feeling of tightness, smoothness, and difficulty when the gears meshed with each other. He used these as a basic comparison to make the corresponding corrections. Gradually, this feeling became more abundant, becoming more exquisite and complicated. Sometimes, his reaction couldn't keep up, and it was hard for him to make adjustments in time. Chapter 850. The interference power that came from within the light carried a familiar flavor. This was the unique quality of a true god. It wasn't an absolute thing to say. Even though they were of the same system, the feeling the Pope gave off was more or less the same. In any case, it was the kind of bright, dazzling, fully burning, scorching feeling. This power combined with the rules and laws of the great divine treasure of the propping mulberry tree. It was like a propulsion furnace that supplied energy to the propping mulberry tree. It was also like the entire propping mulberry tree was its fuel. However, there was still a slight difference from the brief confrontation that occurred a few days ago in the wilderness laboratory. Back then, the true god, under the urging of negative emotions, did not hold back at all. The true god tore through the barrier of the void and smashed over. But now, the true god was in a semi-detached state, performing a routine scan. He had accidentally caught the true god pausing for an instant before the true god exerted its power a second time. This tiny disconnect was far too obvious and slow on Luonan's current level. He even had the time to adjust a set of configuration details in response to the sudden change in environment. Only then did he stir, allowing the projected spacetime bubble, no, it should be said that the game character he had just created, to log in and go online. No matter how tedious, tense, and precise the preparatory work he had done before logging in, no matter how much energy he had consumed, Luonan's mood was strangely calm when he truly arrived at the moment of verification. Against the light that illuminated the surrounding seabed, Luonan came into contact with the true god's pressure that penetrated through space. He had a rough idea of what was going on. A slight distortion occurred in the structure of the seawater 100 meters deep. A high-frequency vibration existed on the mental plane, destroying the existing environment. It also forced the surrounding living beings to break away from their original rhythm and expose themselves. The true god's methods could not be said to be wrong. In fact, they were quite brilliant. The underwater life forms in the surrounding area were like a sieve. They were screened out as long as they had the slightest bit of suspicion. Immediately after, a scorching mental attack like an electric net came down with a buzz. In 3 to 5 seconds, the lives of over a dozen species, whether they were mutants or ordinary sea creatures, were forcefully stripped away. But at this time, the new character who had just logged in followed the tiny arc of the distorted spacetime structure. It smoothly shuttled back and forth. It was as if the character was sliding on a guideway. Even though there was still a slight dissonance when the gears were engaged and switched, it added a proper texture. He was just taking a break from his busy schedule to experience the illusory pleasure of being completely unrestrained. Luonan was not completely illusory. In this state, Luonan already possessed the foundation of self-sufficient physical laws to a certain degree through the combination and interference of spacetime configurations. In fact, half a year ago, Luonan had used the condensation ring to break through the barrier between the mental and material planes in one fell swoop. He had realized the leap from 0 to 1. He had flown at a speed that exceeded everyone's imagination on this great road to the heavens. From the copulation between the condensation ring and the external neuron to the birth of the soul cloak. From the coupling of the divine chakra and the body chakra to the deep-sea scene that was the foundation of the framework. Then, in the form of a soul cloak, it completely broke free from its shackles and extended to cover the earth and many other dimensions of space and time. When Luonan's attainments on the mental plane repeatedly broke through the limits of the imagination of ordinary people, the configuration system of the virtual brain system gave Luonan a timely path to deepen and feed back. His rapid progress in configuration design, especially in the design of spacetime configurations, allowed him to draw support from the omnipresent water molecules of every plane of space and time. He could even draw support from the even more inconceivable structure of space and time itself to construct a material foundation. He could twist the physical laws and temporarily replace a portion of his fleshly body. This gave him a feeling of immersion that was close to reality. Needless to say, there was even the true God, a scene setter. Right now, the true God was no longer making meaningless attempts after repeated fruitless attempts to converse with Luonan. Correspondingly, his methods became even more intense. The pitch-black curtain of night between the sea and the sky had already been sliced to pieces by the true God's blazing killing intent. In an area with a diameter of nearly 100 kilometers, a long and narrow band of intense light and lightning was left in the atmosphere. It left marks on the retinas of living beings that were hard to fade away in a short amount of time. The layers were complex and crisscrossed like an inescapable net. Any living being within this area, whether they were swimming in the sea, flying in the air, or floating on the surface of the water, was faced with imminent disaster. Even if they were not directly cut, just the aftershocks of the overlapping vibrations would press down from the mental plane to the material plane. Then the aftershocks would reverse the effects. After a few rounds of interference, a high-temperature furnace of boiling poisonous gas was formed. The violent killing intent of an extraordinary was far deadlier than any poison in the world. The true God was absolutely not the kind of idiot who wouldn't turn back until he ran into a wall. Don't look at how he had chased Luonan for a long time without success. He had other methods of dealing with this process. The projection of the Fusang divine tree shot through the air within this land of death. Its incorporeal roots extended outwards, greedily devouring the flesh, blood, and life force of the surrounding living beings. It borrowed the nourishment of the boiling emotions between life and death to gradually turn from a projection of nothingness into reality. At the very least, the power descending from the abyssal region grew more and more real and terrifying. At the same time, it formed an even more powerful compression effect on the surrounding void. The true God seemed to have sensed something. Having lost a reliable fulcrum of believers, it was very difficult for the true God to display a direct method like he did a few days ago in the wilderness. But the method of boiling a frog in warm water possessed a certain degree of feasibility. It manifested the true God's clear train of thought that was the complete opposite of his violent actions. The undulating undulations of his soul cloak were weakening in regularity. This was the result of the water molecules pervading the atmosphere suffering substantial damage. This was also the result of the warping and deformation of the structure of space and time. It was as if Luonan was playing a game of parkour. He had to find a relatively safe route in this vile environment. He had to avoid the projected space-time bubble from colliding head-on with the true God's Fusang divine tree system. Fortunately, this game had a time limit and a finish line. The true God's methods had already partially exceeded the scope of the Fusang divine tree system. It was the type of overclocking. Don't look at the oppressive warm water on the plane of reality. Compared to the abyssal region, it was already a volcanic eruption-like impact and turbulence. This was a good thing. Even with the true God's abilities, it was impossible to maintain this impact force for a long period of time over 1,000 kilometers. Therefore Luonan knew what he had to do. His consciousness anchored the destination within the intermittent soul cloak and the warping void gap. It was the intercontinental airship that was gradually slowing down. It was already beginning to deviate from its course. It was also the location of the trap set up by the true God and the Pope. Luonan could more or less guess the situation over there. But no matter what, it was better for everyone to meet face to face. Chapter 852. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain of this flight. After careful evaluation, I am sorry to inform you that this flight will be turning around and returning. Yukawa Aisuk was sitting sideways on his seat with most of his legs stuck in the aisle. His body was slack and he was still trying to digest the changes that had happened before and after he fainted. He was not in a good state. The aftereffects of forcefully attaching his soul had yet to subside. His skull was buzzing and occasionally there was a sharp tinnitus. Under such circumstances he automatically filtered out most of the broadcast information of the flight, leaving only the most important word: return. His eyeballs moved and he glanced sideways from the corner of his eye. The key factor that caused all this was right in front of him. Less than 3 meters away, the puppet controlled by the Pope, like Yukawa Aisuk, was sitting sideways on his seat facing the aisle, with his elbows on his knees and his body slightly leaning forward. This posture had not changed for a long time. But compared to the moment when Yukawa Aisuk opened his eyes, this puppet that looked like a business elite seemed to have been sucked dry of blood and water. All that was left was a skinny silhouette like a mummy. There was almost no breath coming in and out of its mouth and nose. With such damage to its body, it was already a miracle that it could maintain the most basic vitality. It would be difficult to do anything more than that. But to the Pope, this was not a problem at all. The Pope's consciousness was still here, calmly calculating and living within his means to maintain the puppet's breath. At the same time, everyone in the first-class cabin still had to rely on him to survive. It was precisely because this breath was too weak that everyone in the spacious cabin held their breaths. In most cases they were like wooden statues. Yukawa Aisuk was the same. No one restrained him, but in this kind of atmosphere, the only things he could use were his eyes and thoughts. In the beginning he only looked at his surroundings dizzily, passively accepting the drastic changes that happened after the nightmare. As time passed, his mushy brain began to slowly recover. Although this kind of recovery first brought about a sense of pain. Yukawa Aisuk saw the virtual workspace in front of the Pope's puppet, saw the mimicry of the spiritual sea, and saw the continuous appearance of chaotic ripples. Of course, he had heard and seen how the Pope taught Bai Xinyan how to operate the corresponding equipment. He almost didn't dare to think too deeply about the logic behind it. His mouth was full of bitterness. If possible, he hoped to delete all the orders and bargaining records related to the mimicry generator a few days ago, both in reality and in people's memories. However, this was only wishful thinking. Perhaps the relevant information was already placed on the Pope's desk, just waiting for an opportunity to act up. When I go back to Ban City, I must. Can I not go back? Speaking of which, it was absolutely impossible for Yukawa Aisuk to leave the Pope puppet's side. As long as he recalled the scene where his mind felt as if he was trapped in a prison, his body involuntarily being controlled by others, fear and despair would follow him like a shadow, and there was no way to get rid of it. With the Pope by his side, Luonan wouldn't come again, right? Yukawa Aisuk adjusted his line of sight and looked at the porthole on the other side of the aisle. The first thing he saw was Kitano Suzuto's stout back. His head bodyguard's mind was no longer on his job. Instead, he was focused on observing the scene outside the porthole. Yukawa Aisuk could understand this. This was because at this moment, there was a strong light burning marks on the airship's porthole from time to time. At first, the marks were blurry and intermittent, but they became clearer and denser. That was, the true God has captured Luonan's position. I hope it's true this time. Bai Xinyan, who was in the back seat, spoke as she adjusted the parameters of the equipment. Her tone was very pragmatic, but because she was too pragmatic, she didn't seem to pay much attention to details. As she spoke, the deformed sound of the atmosphere penetrated the airship's armor and transmitted inside. It rumbled in everyone's ears. This was the power of a true God. Who knew if it was his emotions? Bai Xinyan smiled faintly. But there is one thing that can be confirmed. Luonan didn't successfully escape. His judgment was correct. The mummified Pope puppet didn't respond. Clearly, the Pope didn't want to waste his limited resources on idle chatter. On the other hand, Yukawa Aisuk's thoughts were still wandering. He subconsciously looked at his wristwatch. 22:42. It had been almost 20 minutes since he woke up. It was about the same amount of time since the most recent capture by a true God. During this period of time, almost everyone felt that Luonan had escaped. But now the Pope was waiting silently. This perfectly displayed the difference in judgment between extraordinaries and normal people. But looking at it from another angle, Luonan, the bandit who could deprive others of their mental autonomy at any time, had endured under the eyes of a true God and the Pope for over 20 minutes. He had nearly exhausted the last drop of the Pope puppet's blood essence. He had almost succeeded. Unfortunately, he had failed on the verge of success. This was how Yukawa Isuke understood it. Why would he think of taking the initiative to provoke such a person? Every time he thought of this, Yukawa Isuke felt as if a handful of iron sand had been shoved into his chest, rubbing against it repeatedly. In any case, he should have let the true God and the Pope succeed this time. They should have killed that bastard. But in case they didn't, Yukawa Isuke subconsciously shivered. It was at this time that the cool bottle rested on the back of his hand. He almost subconsciously pushed it away, only to discover that something was wrong halfway through. It was a bottle of water from Bai Xinyan. Ah, thank you. Yukawa Isuke subconsciously took it. He still remembered the warning and reminder Bai Xinyan gave him in that nightmare, before he completely lost control of his body. This was a favor. But correspondingly, there were still some doubts in his heart that had yet to be cleared up. Just from today's incident alone, did he really provoke that uninvited bandit? He did offend Luonan quite badly. Taking the airship far away from Ban City really gave Luonan the opportunity to make a move. But there was a faintly discernible sense of dislocation. What was going on? Yukawa Isuke shook his wrist, causing the bottle of mineral water to shake as well. It made a hua-hua sound. Perhaps he should do more research. For example, he should give Ban City a call. Most of the time he was driven by his instincts. He did whatever he thought of. For a moment he forgot about the situation in front of him. He found the communication number of his subordinate, Takemoto Shigeru, and was about to make a call. What can you see like this? You might as well drink it quickly. Bai Xinyan's voice interrupted at this time, disrupting Yukawa Isuke's plan. Huh? Yukawa Isuke was a bit stupefied. Why did her words not connect? Did she miss something in the middle? That was indeed the case. At this time, Kitano Sukito, who had been observing the scene outside the porthole, had already turned around. He saw his boss's expression and coughed lightly. Miss Bai is talking about the problem of Luonan's extraordinary power acting as a medium. Luonan is an expert in manipulating water. Kitano Sukito was giving a reminder. His technique was a bit crude, but it was also the result of the current tense situation. It was hard for people to care about meaningless etiquette and face. They were straightforward, with few decorations. Yukawa Isuke didn't quite understand, but he didn't bother to hide it. So, he is one of the few people in the world with the most profound attainments in the condensation ring. Perhaps he is second only to Her Majesty Empress Wu. The condensation ring is currently the most efficient configuration technology known to probe into the water molecule level. Bai Xinyan pointed at the mimicry image of the mental sea. She also pointed at the corner of the image. She made some notes based on the changes in the image. Right now we can basically confirm that every time he appears, the water molecules in the atmosphere are abnormally active. The bubbles in the bottle of water were quite obvious just now. I was wondering if this was due to some sort of resonance effect. The corner of Yukawa Isuke's eye twitched a few times. The bottle of water in his hand suddenly turned into a red-hot soldering iron, sticking to the flesh of his palm. It was not easy to hold it, nor was it easy to throw it away. After a few seconds, Yukawa Isuke finally made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "Then go ask him." Bai Xinyan smiled. She gestured to Yukawa Isuke to take a good look at the current state of the Pope's puppet. The latter's stiff, mummified appearance was the best reason. Yukawa Isuke took a deep breath. Was strange. After the previous round of torment, the atmosphere that made people dare not even breathe had become lively. Although the Pope's consciousness was probably still watching everything coldly, or maybe he was silently keeping score. At least for now, he didn't have the intention to blame anyone, let alone the strength to do so. Whether it was a brilliant realization or a broken pot, Yukawa Isuke's breathing had indeed become a lot livelier. The corner of his mouth twitched. He threw the bottle of water in his hand back to Bai Xinyan. "You came to this conclusion after observing for such a long time?" Bai Xinyan caught it firmly. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp without any misgivings. She exhaled a long breath, looking like she was drinking fine wine. "I didn't need to observe to come to this conclusion. Since you made a move against him, did you not read Persona?" Persona? Why did? Yukawa Isuke still had an impression of it. The target of this intelligence analysis, named Persona Mask, was Luonan. The information had been published more than half a year ago. At that time, Luonan was using the cage theory to sweep away the traditional soul theory of the inner world. It was quite popular for a time, but the analysis itself was a bit secretive. The follow-up was not followed up in time, so it slowly lost its popularity. The version in Yukawa Isuke's hands also included the comprehensive analysis of various sources by his family's intelligence personnel. The research was more comprehensive than the one on the market. But what did Bai Xinyan mean by mentioning it? Bai Xinyan took a big gulp of mineral water. Her eyes wandered as if she was tipsy. Answer. According to the logic of the persona mask, Professor Luo has three basic faces: rationality, strength, and weakness. Which face are we facing now? It's rationality. It wasn't Yukawa Isuke who answered. It was the Pope's puppet that let out a buzzing sound. This body has finally reached its limit. Your Majesty, is there any other way to persevere? As soon as these words left her mouth, Bai Xinyan immediately received a dozen gazes from all around her, especially the bodyguards who were trying their best to hide in the shadows. They looked like they were about to collapse. The problem was that their wills were never taken into consideration. That included Bai Xinyan. In the next second, an indescribable shadow filled the eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Yukawa Isuke felt as if he had taken a step into the shade of the branches and leaves under the sun. To be more precise, he himself was part of the shade. He faced the blazing sun while weaving the shadows. Everyone in the first-class cabin was probably doing this. This shade was not meant for them to enjoy. The Pope puppet was completely motionless. Having used up its last drop of blood essence, it had completely turned into a dried corpse. Meanwhile, the Pope's will, which had borrowed the existence of its corpse, conveniently entered the tree's shade. Using an exquisite guiding power, it intersected the branches and leaves in all directions, ultimately forming a tree nest that was the structure of a spiritual vessel. A wonderful feedback came. Yukawa Isuke suddenly realized that he had a bit of the ability to communicate in the mental realm. This ability was undoubtedly given to him by the Pope. It was also decided by his current state. In the end, the Pope switched to the mode of mental projection. This time there was no one to act as a power bank. It was probably because the same method was not suitable for a third time. He could only settle for the next best thing. Thus, everyone present, including Yukawa Isuke, became the framework of the so-called tree nest. As for what the tree nest was, not many people understood. It was because it was a construct on the mental plane. According to Yukawa Isuke's understanding, the Pope used the magnetic fields of their lives to build a temporary nest, or safe haven. This provided the conditions for a weak consciousness to stay in space. No one knew the specifics of the situation. Only one thing was certain. The Pope's consciousness could directly appear in their minds, turning into images and sounds to achieve communication. This is a mental technique, but it is not used on the emotional level of Yukawa. Instead, it comes and goes, directly affecting the space-time structure. The Pope seamlessly continued his previous evaluation and analysis of Luo Nan. This was an explanation for purity. Yukawa Isuke should not have understood this. But in this tree nest shadow state, he muddle-headedly understood a lot of conceptual knowledge. He also possessed the ability to make preliminary analysis. It was as if there was a built-in AI operating. Because it was purity, it broke away from the level of the Pope's design. Chapter 855. The intercontinental airship had completed its turn. It was as if it had crashed into a cumulonimbus cloud. Plentiful water vapor and high-altitude astral winds intertwined, instantly blurring the portholes on both sides. Then a nearly parallel waterline was drawn above the airship. In the dark environment, the cloud was like a demon. It danced outside the porthole and was cut into pieces by the waterline. Yukawa Isuke looked at the changes in the environment between light and dark. He was suddenly inspired. In his daze, he forgot about the severe discomfort in his body. At this moment, he seemed to see the aftermath of the collision between Luo Nan and a true god in the void. The collision was so intense that even the sealed cabin seemed to be leaking. Yes, it was the feeling of water vapor blowing on one's face. Yukawa Isuke saw Kitano Suzuto subconsciously wipe his face. Kitano Suzuto's back was facing the direction of the airship. The Pope communicated with Bai Xinyan in the shadow of the tree nest. This was his evaluation of the sudden phenomenon. Nothing solid. You've locked onto it? No. The progression is so beautiful. This was the first time in Yukawa Aishuk's memory that the Pope had an emotional sigh. For a while, there was no response from within the tree nest until the airship shook again. The second wave, the third wave. The shaking of the airship was closely related to the structural changes in the depths of the cloud. Due to the distribution of computational pressure, the relevant information flowed and circulated in the shadow of the tree nest, peeling off layer by layer. Of course, some people knew less and some people knew more. Yukawa Aishuk could see it relatively clearly. He knew that the water vapor cloud was the product of the collision between Luonan and the true god. Luonan used the condensation ring as the basic interference core. It was destined to rely on an abundant water vapor environment. The true god carried out a strong suppression. The collision of the two sides on the material plane caused the water vapor in the sky to condense and explode abnormally, creating this cloud phenomenon. Because of this, the cool feeling of the water vapor was able to penetrate the obstruction of the airship's outer shell and directly affect the people's bodies and minds. It's mixed with fragments from the collapse of the void. If the intensity is increased, this airship will be cut to pieces. But then it will be completely at the extraordinary level. Yukawa Aishuk's thoughts seemed to have left his identity as a passenger and jumped out of his own dimension. With incredible focus, he observed and evaluated the increasingly intense battle. Luonan and the true god were currently locked in front of the airship, in contrast to the aimless pursuit of Luonan. Because of this, the scale of the cumulonimbus cloud that the airship crashed into continued to expand. The airship's strategy was to increase its altitude in an attempt to avoid danger, but the effect was really suspicious. Dark clouds continued to surge in the surroundings. Between the layers of clouds, lightning and fire swam about, flickering and extinguishing. Some of them even struck straight at him. Although they were all blocked by the insulating armor on the outer layer, the thunderous roar still crushed in. Each strike was louder than the last, each strike stronger than the last. The cries and screams from the lower cabins never ceased. This stalemate was really absurd. According to Yukawa Aishuk's observations, the true god should have locked onto Luonan's relative position. It was relative to Luonan's current functional region within the spacetime structure. Right now, he was still bombarding Luonan's outer shell. He had yet to truly explore the core. Luonan was still hidden deep within the void, and the true god was constantly trying to squeeze him out from the spacetime structure. For this reason, Luonan adopted an unprecedented proactive attitude. He forcefully interfered with the plentiful water vapor of the material plane, forming some sort of defense system. He used the mutual interference between the mental and the material plane to continuously dissolve the true god's attacks. This was what the Pope meant by progressive levels. Thoughts that even he himself found hard to understand revolved wildly in Yukawa Aishuk's mind. It was like a drill drilling deeper and deeper, getting closer and closer to that mysterious and unfathomable level. But unwittingly he drilled through the limits of his body. In the end he collapsed. His vision went black and his mind suddenly went blank. Yukawa Aishuk's figure fell forward, falling out of his seat. Fortunately, Kitano Sweto reacted in time. He extended his arm to block, preventing Yukawa Aishuk from hitting the ground. But at this moment, the shadow of the tree nest was affected by Yukawa Aishuk's mental disruption. It lost an important support and the structure of the mental plane suddenly shook. Yukawa Aishuk fainted in time, so he wasn't affected. As for the others, whether it was Bai Xinyan, Kitano Sweto, or the group of bodyguards, they were all affected to varying degrees. For a moment, the sky was dark, and there was strong light and high temperature that penetrated the shadow barrier. It was much more refreshing than being exposed to the sun. Several people let out muffled groans. Most likely they suffered damage on the mental plane. The Pope's telepathic thoughts paused for a moment, and then the structure of the tree nest returned to normal. But at this moment, the mummified puppet suddenly fell to the ground. Bai Xinyan, who was in front of him, didn't reach out. She watched as the corpse fell to the ground with a muffled thud. Bai Xinyan's eyebrows twitched. She could confirm that the Pope had left the last bit of blood essence in the puppet's body to save the situation. He had burned it in this accident. She sighed. Sometimes having the ability is a problem. Yeah. The Pope's telepathic thoughts were quite steady. He didn't have any intention of venting his anger, and he couldn't find a reason to be angry. Anyone with eyes could see that Yukawa Isuke's fall was almost certain. His thoughts were unexpectedly compatible in the field of spacetime configuration, which caused the analytical pressure to be too great, and his physical fitness couldn't keep up. It was like using a primitive single-cylinder engine to drag a heavy truck, and still having to run at the speed of an F1. It was only a matter of time before the tank exploded. Since the Pope had used the structure of the tree nest to divert some of the pressure to others, and obtain the effect of reducing the pressure, he had to bear the corresponding risk. Bai Xinyan timely said, "Misfortune may be a blessing in disguise. I still have to congratulate your Majesty on obtaining another beautiful and talented person." In the shadow of the tree nest, she could no longer feel the Pope's emotional response. It was as if he had sunk into emptiness and swallowed the corresponding information. But Bai Xinyan still had a feeling that something had been hooked by an invisible claw, and disappeared without a trace. Was it the Pope's firm judgment and confidence? Bai Xinyan frowned slightly. Half a second later she suddenly stood up, and directly stepped over the mummified corpse of the Pope's puppet, and walked to the front of the first-class cabin. Kitano Sueto, who was in front, was stunned for a moment. He quickly used the opportunity to help his boss settle down to make a path. The Pope was still there, but the puppet still had some kind of symbolic meaning. When the puppet fell, it was as if a switch had been flipped, and an invisible layer of restraint was released from the body of the people. Bai Xinyan was only the first to verify it. The advantage of intercontinental airships over traditional passenger planes was that they were stable, safe, and relatively spacious. The first-class cabin was also first-class in terms of space utilization and enjoyment. There was even a small observation deck at the front, which was the best view of the entire airship, second only to the cockpit. But it was night time and there had been many unforeseen events. The observation deck was wrapped in thick armor and it was tightly sealed. Of course, this was not a problem for Bai Xinyan. After a few steps, the outer armor was slowly opened under her permission. When Bai Xinyan walked up to the observation deck, footsteps sounded behind her. It was Kitano Sueto. This head bodyguard of the Yuchuan family, even if it was just a physical body, was still a B-level powerhouse. In the structure of the tree nest, he was shouldering a lot of the pressure. Correspondingly, he also had his own thoughts about the situation, but he was just suppressing them. Bai Xinyan did not care what he was thinking. She looked at the dark clouds in front of her. Just then, another lightning bolt struck down from the sky, illuminating the outline of the clouds that were like the precipice of an abyss. The incoming clouds were like beasts and demons that lived among them. They hit the outer shell of the airship and instantly shattered, then reassembled into other demonic shapes. After a second, Kitano Sueto, who was beside her, let out a low gasp. Over there. What affected his breathing was not the cloud phantom that was pouncing at him, but an area further away between the flowing and changing clouds. There was an obvious difference. How to put it? If the outer layer of scattered clouds was peeled off, the central area was obviously also made of clouds, but the outline was sharp, orderly, and full of artificial sturdiness. Another lightning bolt struck down, directly piercing through the outer layer of clouds and bombarding that area. In the eyes of Bai Xinyan and Kitano Sueto, faint ripples appeared in the void. The lightning bolt warped and curled around the periphery of that area until it dissipated. Some of the dissipated lightning eventually broke through, collapsing a corner of the cloud structure. But soon lightning surged to fill the gap. It was still a square block, but it felt even more sturdy. It was simply a defensive fortification built by relying on the cloud mountain. Or perhaps it was a towering mountain pass in front of the airship. No matter how the outer layer of clouds changed, no matter how powerful the lightning bolt struck, that area continued to be fortified. It gave people the feeling that if the airship were to collide with it, it would most likely be smashed into smithereens. A fortress of the Ring of Blood will? Bai Xinyan glanced over. This one sentence proved that Kitano Sueto had done his homework on Luonan. Of course, this was due to the fact that this toy was famous. It only existed in the circle of ability users in Xia City. It was a marvelous configuration design that spread through all sorts of channels. If it were projected onto the plane of reality, it would probably look like this. Bai Xinyan did not object. She just muttered, "The Ring of Blood will fortress?" The two of them spoke one after another, but before they could really communicate, a strong light suddenly burst out of the gloomy clouds. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the level of lightning. The light was as dazzling as the sun, but it did not follow the trajectory of the sky at all. Instead, it fell straight towards the pass, ahead. At this moment, the cumulonimbus clouds with abundant water vapor seemed to have been ignited. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.